powerful you have become, Dooku. The
The
dark side I sense in you.
When their battle droids are combined with yours, we shall have an army greater than any in the galaxy.
Why did the Separatist worlds absolutely love Dooku despite the fact that he was a Sith Lord? Welcome back, Acolytes, to the archives. We've been expecting you. Dooku could easily be called the Palpatine of the Separatist movement. He was their leader, the one that held them all together, and the one that essentially started the Confederacy of Independent Systems. Yet behind closed doors, he was a menacing Sith Lord, Darth Tyranus, the one who took advantage of his own homeworld and committed countless atrocities over the galaxy in the name of peace. And yet, the wide populace of the Separatist movement absolutely adored the Count. Their loyalty to Dooku remained steadfast from the moment that the Clone Wars broke out to the moment that the Empire was abolished, and even further beyond. So in today's Holocron recording, we're going to take a look at what made Dooku such a beloved icon outside of the Republic. Start. The war between the Republic and the Separatists was a lot more complicated than it seemed on the surface. When we watch the Clone Wars from the actual battle's perspective, it's very clear cut on who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. The Confederacy was prone to exploiting planets for resources, slave labor, piracy, and even testing chemical weapons on civilian populations. It was the Republic and the Jedi that were the ones that would step in and foil these plans in order to save the day. But on the political side of things, those that joined the Separatist cause were not always greedy, mustache-twirling bureaucrats with a private droid army at their disposal. These were people who needed to feel heard because their world and their people were suffering. To fully understand Dooku's role in the Separatist movement, we have to establish why the CIS seceded in the first place. The Confederacy was largely made up of worlds from the Mid and the Outer Rim, who unfortunately received less support and representation in the Senate. This was simply due to their proximity to the galactic core. The galactic core, of course, being where the Republic had the most influence. Over the centuries, yes, centuries, the Senate was prioritizing either core worlds or within the immediate vicinity of the core, allowing those worlds to grow fat while they neglected the Outer Rim. Some of this was purposeful, but a lot was simply ineffectual leadership on behalf of the Republic. This would all come to a head in the year 32 BBY, when the Republic would face one of their first real challenges. The invasion of Naboo by the Trade Federation exposed the unwillingness and inability of the Senate to resolve a deadly crisis. This ended only after the Gungans, the Royal House of Naboo, and the Jedi allied together to do it themselves. And even the Jedi had to go against the wishes of the Council. Talking about Qui-Gon here. The lack of action was a result of years of corruption and ineffectual governance by the Republic. This is not an opinion, this is fact. The Republic had become mired in its bureaucracy and layers upon layers of increasingly complex legal precedents, treaties, and obligations. The commerce guilds and trading cooperations had also become disillusioned after laws were passed that would introduce taxes affecting all significant trade routes. These taxes were implemented in such a way that they would have the greatest impact on the poorer, outlying star systems, particularly those in the Outer Rim. These worlds were often forced into accepting one-sided deals with the exploitative corporations that the Republic supported. If this wasn't bad enough though, the outlying systems of the rimward trade routes were plagued by pirates, hijackers, and slavers. Due to the refusal of the Republic to create a military which would serve the police in these sectors, the judicial department of the Republic was completely overwhelmed and simply left these worlds to the whims of pirates. There was no way that they could adequately protect either their worlds along those trade routes or the cargo vessels that was traversing them. This forced the outlying systems to begin creating their own militias in order to deal with these pirates. The government was not helping. The Republic refused to help. The Outer Rim was forced to fight wars with pirates and warlords, causing many of their own people to die in mass, all with absolutely no help from the Republic. All of this was going on while the Senate was unable to properly pass any legislation, and as all meetings kept coming to a standstill, the number of votes needed to pass any type of legislation turned increasingly into a place where senators bartered for favors and votes for personal power, without any regard for their constituencies or the greater good of the Republic. They didn't care about that any longer. So who or what could possibly expose such political corruption when no one seemed to care? Who would break this hold when even the Jedi were wrapped up in the politics of the Senate? Enter one Count Dooku, the champion of the disenfranchised worlds of the Outer Rim. Dooku had recently departed the Jedi Order due to this very problem, He had negotiated with Palpatine on how to completely bring down the Republic and the Jedi, and in Dooku's opinion, the Republic was so rotten to its core that even the Sith were able to get a hold of it. By now it was time to wipe the slate clean, destroy it all, replace it with an empire. And in order to do just that, they would need to engineer a war to further weaken the Republic, to place Palpatine in a position of ultimate power. The easy choice to begin a separatist movement was Dooku, who is the form of a noble family in the Outer Rim, and was already passionate towards the plight of the Rim worlds after witnessing the corruption of the Republic firsthand on Coruscant. The war would all begin with what is known as the Raxus Address. This was a powerful, rousing speech delivered by Dooku to the people of Raxus in 24 BBY. The speech was broadcasted all over the Raxus system and became a famous historical holovid. In the speech, Dooku proclaimed that the Republic had become corrupt, ineffectual, evil. The only way for the Rimworlds to get what they deserved was to secede and to form their own government so that they could look out for one another instead. Dooku would then spend a great deal of time traveling to many worlds around the Rim, personally giving similar speeches to each of them. All of this, of course, being in between training sessions with Sidious. Dooku was captivating, alluring, trusting, and powerful. He inspired hope and indignation in the hearts of people who had to send their sons and daughters to die in militias. Militias that should have never been formed while they lived in relative squalor. As a nobleman, Dooku's well-groomed and well-spoken appearance gave him a sense of gravitas to command attention. But because he was an aristocrat that fronted as a man who cared about the Commonwealth, people believed him. They needed something to believe in. He wasn't like the bureaucrats in the Republic, always greasing each other's palms for more power and wealth. As an ex-Jedi, Dooku came with the appearance of great wisdom and compassion. The populace were fully aware that he used to be a Jedi and did not hide from the public why he left the Order. This added to his visage as a wise and a powerful man who went against the established order for the common good of the galaxy. According to the story, while the Jedi Order had become the lapdogs of the greedy Senate, Dooku bravely rejected them, struck off on his own righteous crusade. Dooku's influence spread, and he became an overnight celebrity. The prestigious Rena University on Raxus held a lecture series known as Count Dooku, Words of Truth. Here, the Count was to speak further on the corruption and the bureaucracy of the Republic. Dooku just didn't make speeches to the Separatists though, but also directly to the Republic, making demands on their behalf and presenting himself as the voice of the people. Not even the Jedi perceived him as being menacing, as Mundi pointed out that Dooku was accused of being the assassin, that he was called a political idealist, not a murderer. The Jedi Order greatly still respected Dooku before the Clone Wars broke out. Many Jedi likely thought he was secretly correct. He was one of Yoda's only apprentices after all. They saw him as brilliant, knowledgeable, caring, and perhaps Dooku had once been all of those things. While it was problematic that he was running a propaganda campaign against the Republic, it was well within his rebellious nature. And this is to say that even the Jedi refused to believe that he was a threat, until the truth was shoved up their nose in the Battle of Geonosis, and Dooku embarrassed them, proved that they were mortal. But as for his alignment, no one in the Confederacy knew that Dooku was a Sith. Any business he conducted was done under the shroud of Darth Tyranus, and while he wore his lightsaber on his belt, he never brandished it in front of anyone, simply allowing it to be a representation of his former status as a Jedi. But the most important part to understand about this is not many people in the galaxy knew what a Sith Lord was. By this point in the galactic zeitgeist, the Sith were ancient history, an ancient cult of extinct weirdos that once battled the Jedi thousands of years ago. If you were to go to any school in Star Wars and in the wider galaxy, you would have to take special history classes or make it your major to even learn about the Sith. But luckily for you, the archives are at your disposal, and you can learn as much as you want. Anyway, in the Republic comics, Palpatine mentions this very thing. He was explaining to the Jedi that most people either never heard of a Sith or believed that they were the mythical boogeymen, to suggest that the compassionate Count of Sereno was one of these death-worshipping anti-Jedi was laughable to the Separatists. As for his atrocities during the Clone War, the Separatists didn't know that either. Dooku had a tight grip on the propaganda stream, and he shielded the Confederate public from what he was actually doing on the front lines. They had no knowledge of the oppression and destruction wrought by the droid army or Separatist weapons. In fact, Dooku supported the use of droids, stating that this was a virtuous thing. He stated that while the Republic used lab-grown slaves to be sent to die, the Separatists utilized only machines. That way, no one's children would have to die on their behalf for a war that they did not want. This spoke true to the Separatist heart. You can imagine how this made everyone love and adore Dooku even more. In fact, right after Dooku oversaw the massacre of the population of Maharoni, he went to accept the Raxian Humanitarian Award at an extremely fancy gala. This shows just how oblivious the Separatist Parliament was to the horrors happening on the front lines. Dooku had played them all for fools. Even if he did have some care about what happened to the Rim worlds, it was all in service of building an empire. Eventually the day would come when he would backstab his own people, put them under Imperial oppression. But since he died before that happened, the Separatists continued to view Dooku as a visionary, a champion of justice. But anyway, the fall of Dooku was the first trumpet of the Jedi's Judgment Day. As one of the rare few Padawans of Yoda, Dooku had the kind of notoriety within the Jedi Order that could not be bought. But as he grew, Dooku developed his own ideas towards the Jedi's view on the Force, their political stances, as well as how it intertwined with the Senate. Tensions began to grow between himself and the High Council, and all of this would eventually come to a breaking point when Qui-Gon Jinn was executed by Darth Maul. It was this event which saw Dooku surrender to the dark side. But while that story is very well understood, what isn't is why Dooku continued to work with the man that directly was responsible for his beloved friend's death, his Padawan Qui-Gon Jinn. It was the Sith who killed Qui-Gon, so how did Darth Sidious justify this to Dooku? What excuse could Palpatine have possibly conjured to tame the wrath of his newest pupil? In today's Holocron, we get to revisit the complex mind of one of our favorite characters of the lore. We'll be exploring both Legends and Canon in order to explain exactly why Dooku continued to work with the Sith despite them being responsible for his greatest tragedy. We want to prevent one of our greatest tragedies, which is you missing out on our daily Holocron uploads. So, reach out with the Force and crush that subscribe button if you haven't yet. It is your destiny. Now, Acolytes, let's begin. The reason we wanted to separate and describe Dooku's reaction in both Legends and Canon is because his fall is different between the two continuities. This results in there being some subtle nuances in each scenario. In both cases though, Dooku has been growing disillusioned with the Jedi Order for quite some time, based mainly on political factors. But in Legends, Dooku has been flirting with the idea that one could use the dark side without being corrupted by it. His secret challenge of Jedi doctrine, as well as his mixed feelings on the understanding of prophecy, eventually all come to a head. This makes him feel as though the Council was willingly blinding themselves to the Force. For several months prior to Dooku's departure, he would have secret meetings with none other than Senator Palpatine. Darth Sidious did not reveal himself as a Sith Lord here though, and in fact would not do so for quite some time. However, the two men spoke candidly about the problems in the Senate and the problems with the Jedi, and Palpatine continued to stoke Dooku's feelings of disillusionment with the High Council. However, it would be Qui-Gon Jinn's death in 32 BBY that was the final straw. This event was specifically what made Dooku depart the Jedi Order. He even began to make public appearances and speeches denouncing the corrupt politics of the Senate. But in his own public address, he did not give a reason for his decision to depart the Jedi Order, nor did he provide one to the High Council when he was directly summoned to their chambers. They were all in shock that Dooku had decided to leave. And to honor him, the Jedi gave him a place among the Lost Masters, making him the 20th Master of the famous Lost 20. Shortly after this, Dooku met with Palpatine and informed the Chancellor that he intended to claim his hereditary title as the Count of Sereno. But the conversation takes a swift turn. Qui-Gon Jinn's death was approached, and Dooku admitted to having had thoughts about hunting down the second Sith Lord in order to exact revenge. This was the Count's initial thought process, which was to take a vigilante justice approach with his own hands against the Sith. However, curiously, Dooku didn't actually take any steps in these plans, as he decided to think it over for a while longer. To Palpatine's surprise, Dooku revealed that his line of thought had quickly changed. He now saw a potential alliance with the Sith. Dooku's reasoning was that he believed they shared his aim to reforge the galaxy, and in addition, Dooku finally reveals who he truly holds responsible for the death of Qui-Gon Jinn. Dooku even goes as far to say is that he believes the High Council is just as responsible for Qui-Gon's death as the Sith that murdered him with his hand. This is what their short-sightedness, their hubris that made them dangerous, and so Dooku decided to leave the Jedi Order. What's shocking is in Legends continuity, Palpatine really doesn't say anything to convince Dooku one way or the other. He had actually justified it within his own mind already. Dooku shifted the blame largely to the shoulders of the Council. If they had not allowed the Senate to control them with such a tight leash, if they were able to enforce peace the way that they should have been able to, then Qui-Gon Jinn would have had the resources to fix the issues on Naboo personally. He may not have had to face the Sith alone, and interestingly, he still knew that the Sith were evil. However, Dooku saw that perhaps they had a much better plan of cleansing the galaxy than the Jedi did. Dooku believed that with the burning power of the dark side, they could cleanse the Republic by fire since they were willing and able to do what the Jedi no longer would. To Dooku, they would usher in and rewrite all of the corruption that had gripped the Senate and the Jedi. So all in all, Dooku came to view Qui-Gon Jinn's death as a tragic catalyst, one that proved the Jedi were impotent, and the drastic action was needed. He believed in his friend's demise, this being more of a result of the Council's failings than the Sith's evil. To Dooku, Qui-Gon Jinn had died in vain under the old corrupt Republic, but his death could spur the creation of a newer, more just order. At this point, Palpatine did not reveal himself, as he was still unsure of Dooku's true allegiance. It all seemed a bit too convenient to him, so he needed to give it more time, a different approach. This time, he would contact him as Sidious. The two men would have another very long conversation, wherein Dooku found that their ideologies aligned much more than he ever realized, and so, Dooku joined the Sith. He pledged himself to being a part of their order, to pledge himself to the dark side, and to Palpatine. However, Dooku's plan was never to truly become one of the Sith. Dooku planned on simply using the Sith to his own ends, eventually destroying them. But this quickly changed. He underestimated the corruptive power of the dark side, and Dooku was deceived. As he became Darth Tyranus, he was diluted into thinking that he could control the dark side within him. And so after just one Jedi death, he justified another, Sifo Dyas. And again, for Dooku, this was all for the cause that he believed in. But after Sifo Dyas, he justified another, and another. Before long, he had his own collection of lightsabers and tattered Jedi robes, a collection that rivaled even General Grievous, and he lost himself in the process, never to return. In canon, the situation is slightly different. Dooku's departure from the Jedi happened much sooner, and began with a different event. He would disobey the Council and would help his homeworld of Sereno. He then sent back a hologram message directly to Grandmaster Yoda, announcing that he was departing the Jedi Order, desiring to take up his family's title so that he could lead his desperate people. Dooku even offered to bring Yoda his lightsaber, surrendering it to the Grandmaster. But Yoda told him that being a Jedi was much more than having a lightsaber, and that he would find that out soon enough. So Yoda allowed Dooku to keep it. They left off on a respectful term, and the Council ruled that because he was such a respectable, powerful Jedi, that Dooku was allowed within the Jedi Temple anytime he wished. Dooku would sort of vanish for the next stretch of time, as he'd quietly lead Sereno and make frequent visits to the temple. He was even known to sit in on Jedi High Council meetings from time to time. But it was during this period where he would meet Sidious, and the two would find common ground. Dooku's frustrations with the Council were still present even though they were on cordial terms. Dooku would carry out some secret missions for the Sith, which included wiping the data records of Kamino and Dagobah from the archives. All the while though, Yoda failed to sense the growing darkness within his old apprentice. As we witnessed in Tales of the Jedi, Dooku would meet Qui-Gon and learn about the current mission. He would find out about this strange slave boy from Tatooine, and that Qui-Gon was involved in the Naboo crisis. Dooku was aware of the Sith's machinations, but had not known about Qui-Gon's eventual meeting with Maul. Upon learning about Qui-Gon's death though, Dooku was grief-stricken and heartbroken. Like in Legends, he harshly blamed the High Council for not seeing the rise of the Sith sooner, and he felt their short-sightedness made Qui-Gon's death unnecessary. After a meeting with Yaddle once more in the Temple Gardens, Dooku would leave the Jedi Temple for the last time, going to meet with Sidious in their secret complex in the works districts of Coruscant. Dooku refused to join the Jedi for Qui-Gon's funeral. He was too disgusted of them to be in their presence. But Yaddle, concerned for Dooku's well-being, followed him and overheard his conversation with Sidious. Dooku confronted the Sith Lord, equally furious with him as he was the Council. He yelled at Sidious, telling him that he had gone too far by allowing Maul to kill Qui-Gon. This was never the plan. Sidious coldly counts that he had lost an apprentice as well, attempting to state that they had both sacrificed something they cared for their grand plan, and that in the end, it may be worth it. He attempted to soothe Dooku's rage, framing Qui-Gon's death as a necessary evil for peace and order to be restored. However, this made Dooku rethink everything he had done. Kamino, Sifo Dyas, the clones. He had betrayed everything he once loved and believed in. But Sidious reiterated that this was simply the way of things, the way that they had to be for the galaxy to be rebalanced and be made anew. The Jedi Master Yaddle then intervened, denouncing the Sith, begging for Dooku's help. No matter his crimes, they would be acquitted if he simply chose to make things right while he still had the chance. But Sidious reminded Dooku of what he told him, that the Jedi blindly followed a Senate which has now failed the Republic. Ultimately, despite everything that had happened, Dooku believed that it was too late. He would fight and strike down Yaddle in the name of peace and order. This ends justify the means approach, his moral center eroding. He decides to trust Sidious, writing his friend's death off as for the greater good, a sacrifice that needed to be made. And so in an interesting turn of events, there was little that Darth Sidious actually did to excuse Qui-Gon Jinn's death in either canon or legends. Dooku had more so come to his own conclusions and diluted himself into believing the lies of the dark side. In canon, Palpatine did more to convince Dooku as he was also suffering the loss of Maul, so by stating that they had both equally made sacrifices, he acquitted himself of all blame. This was a sneaky and a clever argument, one that Dooku struggled to argue with, as he too believed that the Republic needed to fall, and at the end of the day, Qui-Gon was an agent of the Republic. So my friend, an aspect of Star Wars lore surrounding Dooku and Sidious that has always fascinated me, something that we've seen remarkably little of. Why didn't Darth Sidious train with Dooku? Well, we've looked into the lore extensively, and perhaps maybe he did, but not in the ways that most think. Let's analyze everything we learned. Sidious has had multiple apprentices throughout his tenure as the Dark Lord. The second most successful of them was Darth Tyranus, or better known as Count Dooku. His path to the dark side is legendary due to how dissimilar it is from many other stories of fallen Jedi. Dooku's reasoning for becoming a Sith hadn't been an emotionally charged decision, but rather was one made of logic and rationale. But part of his journey into the Order of the Dark Lords was of course his training, once he swore Sidious as his true master. Interestingly, Palpatine is unlike many other lords of the past, as even though he's eager to take on new apprentices, we rarely actually see him teach them hands-on in any way, unless it's Lord Vader, and even then, the lessons are rare. Unlike Darth Plagueis, who was prone to long lectures about dark side theory, Palpatine taught almost exclusively through experiences. But we don't really hear or see tales of Dooku's training, or his deeper relationship with his master Sidious. We don't really hear or see tales of any of Dooku's adventures. So why is this? Why did Sidious see it fit to teach Tyrannis' Sith Academia as an afterthought? Well, let's open a holocron and dive into the minds of two of our favorite characters in all of the lore. It should be noted that we aren't saying Dooku was not trained at all. We are told through the Legends novel Labyrinth of Evil that Tyrannis actually trained for upwards of 10 years in secret on Coruscant. There was a very shady part of the world's surface which was known as the Works District. No one really lived over there, and the Jedi activity was practically non-existent. There was nothing but droids, construction projects, and mob activity in this part of town. It was here where we have the high-rising rotunda building that Dooku spent his formative Sith years training, under Darth Sidious. This being the same building where Dooku meets with Sidious after the Battle of Geonosis, and the same building where he murdered Jedi Master Yaddle. Due to the specifications of his private shuttle, Dooku was able to slip right into the atmosphere unnoticed and learn the Sith way right under the noses of the Jedi. In the book, it says that Dooku spent his years learning the dark arts, perfecting his craft, and as Dooku guessed, Yoda would have called it, mastering evil. But this Sith training was very much unlike the type of curriculum we saw Sidious undergo when he trained with Plagueis, or really, how any other Sith has been trained at all. Dooku's training was extremely unique. Count Dooku was a man who didn't have to be coaxed to the dark side. Unlike Vader and Maul, Sidious did not thrust the dark side upon them. Dooku, in his musings, believed to join the dark side was to obey the will of the Force. His mindset was like a dark, twisted version of Qui-Gon Jinn's, where to maintain balance would mean to listen to the shifting waves of the Force and embrace the rising tide of darkness. This is what Dooku says. The problem was partially somatic, in that the Jedi Order had seen to it that the dark side of the Force had become equated with evil. But was shade more evil than stark sunlight? Recognizing that the dark side was an ascendant, the Jedi, in service to the Force, should have known enough to embrace it, to ally themselves with it. After all, it was all a matter of balance, and if the preservation of balance required the dark side to be on top, then so be it. Ever since he was a child, Dooku had a fascination with the dark side, and in both canon and legends, he snuck into the forbidden section of the Jedi archives to admire a Sith holocron, one specifically. In some of the later years of his youth, he would even learn from it a little. In canon, it was even revealed that Dooku had an innate ability to conjure force lightning, which was what he did to save himself and his young sister from a gang of pirates that had tried to kidnap them. But while this ability was frightening and even scared a young Dooku, it seems that it didn't eschew it altogether. In secret, Dooku practiced Force lightning, familiarizing himself with the ability that the Jedi would have condemned. And at one point, this practice came in handy when he saved Qui-Gon from an assassin. But in that moment, Dooku took it too far and nearly tortured the assassin to death until Qui-Gon begged for his life. Dooku was a man who believed in practicality. His turn towards the dark side was largely for political reasoning, but there was a part of him that was frustrated and disillusioned with the Jedi for not doing the right thing at the time that it needed to be done, or for not exploring parts of the Force that could help them change the galaxy for the better. By the time Dooku became the apprentice of Sidious, Palpatine himself didn't need to do any of the heavy lifting in Dooku's case. Dooku had already learned to hate the Jedi. All that work was done. To perfectly describe this and what Dooku's training was like, the book Labyrinth of Evil says this. With Dooku, Sidious hadn't had to waste precious hours on lightsaber technique, nor on ridding Dooku of ill habits born of a lifetime spent in the Jedi Temple. For Dooku had long before rid himself of those. Instead, Sidious had focused on giving Dooku what had amounted to a crash course in tapping into the power of the dark side, a mere taste of which had been intoxicating to him, enough to convince Dooku that no course was left open to him but to abandon the Order. More than his entire life had been preparation for his apprenticeship under Darth Sidious. That at long last he had found a true mentor. The Sith saw no need to take on only young disciples, though they often did. Sometimes the training went smoother with disciples who had lived long enough to grow disillusioned, or angry, or vengeful. The point that this makes is that Dooku was halfway there before he ever pledged himself as a Sith. He just needed to be shown the specifics of the dark side. In this case, their study would have been much more academic, and not an emotional journey like Vader or Maul. Tyranus was a go-getter, a pursuer of knowledge personally, which meant that Sidious's teachings were a lot more hands-off than other Sith Lords. But as a result of this, we notice that their relationship is different than Sidious had with Maul or Vader. This is to say, Sidious and Dooku were not very close at all. They didn't have that teacher-student bond, and their interactions were always extremely formal. The nature of their relationship was more like two like-minded men pursuing the same goal, but always keeping an eye on the other. Since they were both much older, with Dooku actually being Palpatine's superior in age, there was a lot of mistrust between them naturally. What's interesting is seeing how Dooku's perspective on the Force and the Sith changes as the Clone Wars rage on. At first, Dooku's mindset was about balance in the Force, and how choosing the dark side had been a practical decision rather than an emotional one. In fact, he had even compared Sidious and Yoda to be quite similar, saying this about them in the book. More than once it had occurred to Dooku that Sidious and Yoda had certain qualities in common, principally that neither was either what they entirely appeared to be. That is, made frail by age, or by the intensity required to master the Sith or the Jedi arts. But as the Clone Wars became longer and more violent, Dooku slipped deeper and deeper into his persona of Tyrannis, and soon he became obsessed with Sith lore and knowledge. He wasted no time in training a host of personal dark acolytes to do his bidding, charging some with concerns on the war effort, or tasking others with the retrieval of Sith artifacts. At this point, he didn't need Palpatine because he was doing his own research. He looked into the histories and located such superweapons like the Dark Reaper, a weapon which could tear the life from an entire army. The weapon had even been used once by Exar Kun, but had been lost to history. Luckily for the Jedi, Dooku would never find the entire weapon, and would be stopped by none other than Anakin Skywalker. But in his research, his prized collectibles were Sith holocrons, just like Sidious. In fact, Dooku would actually go back to the Jedi Temple for one specific holocron in the library, one that fascinated him in his youth. Dooku broke back into the archives via a complicated plot involving new lightsaber-resistant droid prototypes in order to distract the Jedi while he delved deeper into the heart of their temple. Along this way, he used Quinlan Vos to find the holocron of Darth Endedu, the same one used by Darth Bane to discover the secret to immortality. Within that holocron was an ancient red lightsaber crystal which Dooku would actually gift to Quinlan. And finally, he had one other Sith holocron that we don't know much about, other than he gifted it to the leader of the Jedi Order, which was a Force-based cult who believed themselves to be neutral in the Force, but were actually practicing the dark side unknowingly. Perhaps that gift was to bring them deeper into the darkness, so that Dooku could use them. In fact, we're sure that's why he gave them the Sith holocron. By the time Dooku had reached the final year of the Clone Wars though, he was a completely different man. He was vile, cruel, taking pleasure in the torture of others, the fall of the Jedi to the dark side, and even started slaying Jedi by his own hand, something he had vowed against in the very beginning of the war. In this way, Dooku is extremely different from Anakin or Maul. He had successfully killed his former self completely. He gave in fully to the Sith doctrine, unlike Vader, who could never let go of the part of him that was Anakin. Maul, of course, though, was born into darkness. It is all he knew. He did not choose it on his own, but Dooku did. Dooku required very little to no push from Darth Sidious. We've spoken before about how Dooku had mercy on Obi-Wan in their final duel, because essentially he saw Obi-Wan as his grandson. But interestingly, that heartfelt sentiment did not extend as a loving one, but one of possession. Tyranus loathed Anakin and desperately wanted Kenobi to be a part of the Sith. He felt like Obi-Wan alive because he wanted to salvage the chance that he could become a Sith apprentice one day. Dooku believed that when the Empire rose, he would destroy and reform the Jedi Order into a Sith army for the Emperor. But it's likely that Dooku was planning on overthrowing Palpatine at some point and forcibly taking Obi-Wan as his apprentice. This twisted mindset proves that he was truly lost and would never return. Jedi Dooku is dead, and redemption was impossible. But Sidious was always ahead. This meant Dooku suffered from his ambitions. The Count was far too trusting of his master, far too trusting of his plans, and that he would see it through. In reality, the plan was very different than what the two Sith had discussed. Palpatine was either negligent of Dooku's potential, or afraid of it. He only ever saw Dooku as a threat, and a tool to be cast aside at a moment's notice. From the moment of Dooku's death, Sidious would never refer to him as anything more than a piece in a game that must be sacrificed, or a ballistic missile to be pointed in one direction and then thrown away. It was because of this sentiment that we never saw a reason to make Dooku's training anything special. There was no need for a significant investment in time or effort. Not only was Dooku basically training himself, but Sidious also knew that he was by no means an end, a stepping stone to the real prize, Anakin Skywalker. In the time of the Clone Wars, there was no one who could kill Jedi like General Grievous could. Although he was a coward that ran the moment things got out of favor, he introduced himself as a force to be reckoned with in the Battle of Hypori. There, he would best 5 prominent Jedi with relative ease, and since then, Grievous has been known as a monster. Trained by the expert duelist Dooku, he was a Jedi killer like none other before. But while Dooku trained him to deadly perfection, or at least as perfect as Grievous could get without the Force, Count Dooku was unconvinced that the droid general could handle any real challenge. Dooku once very plainly laid out 4 Jedi Masters that he claimed would leave the general in a scrap heap. And what's most interesting is that Anakin Skywalker was not one of them. Welcome back to the archives, my friends. In today's holocron, we are going to be revisiting a topic that has been discussed before, but with a brand new lens. We're going to go over each one of the Jedi that Dooku claimed that could defeat Grievous, and in the process we'll break down each of their fighting styles, which would indicate why Dooku believed this, and why they were too strong for the droid general. But we're also going to explore why he neglected to mention Anakin, and while Grievous may be facing some insurmountable opponents today, luckily, you are not. The only foe that stands between you and the daily uploads of knowledge is the subscribe button, so ignite your lightsaber and slash it apart to become an acolyte today. Now, let's begin. Our source is the Legends Labyrinth of Evil novel, which takes place just before the events of Revenge of the Sith. During a training session with Grievous, Dooku becomes enraged at Grievous's arrogance and spouts this at him. But I pity you should have to face off against any of the council members. Do I need to demonstrate what responses you can expect from Sindralig, or Obi-Wan Kenobi, from Mace Windu, or Stars Help You, Yoda? He flicked his blade quickly, ridding 2 of the guards of their staffs, then placing the glowing tip a millimeter from Grievous's death-helmeted visage. Finesse, artfulness, economy. Otherwise, my friend, I fear that you will end up beyond the repair of even the Geonosians. Do you take my meaning? In just a few words, Dooku says that Sindralig, Kenobi, Windu, and Yoda are the only ones he considers more powerful or more skilled than Grievous. So much so that he essentially says that any of them would obliterate the general. But how accurate is this assumption? We know that in canon lore, Fisto proves to be a good match for Grievous. Kit Fisto's Shi-Cho style allows him to easily fight off multiple enemies, and the randomness of his blade work throws Grievous off entirely. Kit nearly triumphs had it not been for the Magna Guards, but of course that was canon Grievous, who is much less threatening than the Legend's counterpart. Since Labyrinth of Evil was written in 2005, it is using the knowledge of the version of Grievous showcased in the 2003 Clone Wars series. So basically, the hyperpowered devil Jedi murderer. Now the continuity of episode Lair of Grievous is strange. There are some episodes of the 2008 series that are considered a part of Legends as well, which can make the continuity very muddy to follow, and Lair of Grievous just so happens to be one of those that is both considered Legends and canon. We believe it is doubtful that Fisto would prevail against Legends Grievous though, referred to the one in Labyrinth of Evil, but we'll leave you to debate that in the comments down below. Today we want to focus on why Dooku mentions these 4 Jedi Masters specifically, so let's go in the order in the ones that Dooku mentions them, starting with the individual we find to be the most interesting pick, Sindralig. During the era of the Clone Wars, Sindralig is one of the only swordsmen considered even close to being Dooku's equal. He was the Jedi Battle Master, the one who gave cursory training to all initiates in the art of lightsaber combat and basic techniques. Most Padawans learned saber fighting from their individual master, but if a Jedi Knight needed to study a new form, or perfect one that they already were using, they would call Sindralig. Sindralig had mastered all 7 forms of combat, including Form 7 Juyo. This is a very rare feat, one that very few Jedi or Sith can lay claim to. But even those who were proficient in all 7 forms, such as Darth Sidious or Master Yoda, usually chose a specific style and then stuck to it. But Sindralig chose Form 6, Naiman, or Niman. The reason this is significant is because Naiman is a hybrid of all of the 5 previous lightsaber forms. It's incredibly simplistic, and meant to be a form suitable for any situation that a Jedi would find themselves in. It had a reputation of being plain because it had no distinct strengths, but also no distinct weaknesses either. It was considered a Swiss Army knife. It was a multi-tool of a lightsaber form. It was criticized, however, as being overall weaker in blade-to-blade combat, as practitioners often only learned a few sequences from the previous 5 forms that comprised the hybrid Naiman style. But there was one scenario where Naiman was considered weak. That is when the practitioners had partial knowledge of the other lightsaber forms that they were hybridizing. But Sindralig had full knowledge, and he could craft his style to be anything he needed at any given moment. This made him incredibly fluid, as he could also read an enemy's style and mold his own to counter it. And when we take into account Naiman's other strengths, we begin to see why he was so dangerous to Grievous specifically. Naiman was known for 2 important strengths besides being versatile. It was very easy to dual wield in this form, as this style had specific techniques which allowed one to more easily weave force attacks into their blade work. Naiman was originally created by Royal Macateros, which were the royal guards of the Kashi Mer dynasty. The ancient blade form was shockingly similar to Jar Kai, which was the style of their contemporaries, the Yovashen swordsmen. Naiman was developed to more easily incorporate the use of an offhand blade, something that Sindralig often is known to do. This makes him exceptional at dealing with multiple weapons, something that would help him a lot against Grievous. On the second point though, being able to weave in force abilities was not as simple as one would think, but it also pointed to one of Grievous's weaknesses. For a force wielder to use the force in lightsaber combat was exceptionally difficult, as it required an extreme amount of concentration, especially against someone like Grievous who overwhelms Jedi with his many arms so that they cannot build enough focus. He utilizes fear to cripple them, to stop them from falling back on the force where Grievous is obviously weaker because he himself cannot touch it. Naiman, however, excels at teaching certain focus techniques to its practitioners. Focus is important. This allows them to build concentration while fighting when other forms do not allow this. So the bottom line is, Sindralig was a man who mastered all forms of lightsaber combat funneled into a single style. It not only allowed him to perfectly counter his enemy, but he can wield multiple lightsabers and employ force attacks between his strikes. 2 things that just so happen to be Grievous's weakness. If Sindralig can contend against the 4 blades and implement the force into his lightsaber form, it's basically over for the droid general. And if Grievous ever fought him, it would be an absolute nightmare. But next, we have to talk about Dooku's next mention, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Here, Dooku is unwittingly predicting Grievous's demise, but it is quite interesting that Dooku would have Kenobi as a pick and not Anakin. We believe this has something to do with Dooku's pride in his metaphorical grandson. However, there are some things that don't quite add up. We can go into how Obi-Wan's mastery of Surisu makes him perfect to take out Grievous's many arms, and it is. But what makes things even more interesting is at this point in Legends continuity, Dooku is unaware of Kenobi's mastery of Form 3. According to the Revenge of the Sith novelization, this is something that he figures out in their duel on the Invisible Hand, and at this point, Dooku is under the impression that Obi-Wan is still using Qui-Gon's variant of Form 4. So why is Darth Tyranus still so convinced that Grievous would lose to Obi-Wan? The answer is in Obi-Wan's courage. In the words of Dooku previously training with Grievous, he says this: "Remember what I taught you, General. If you are to succeed against the best of the Jedi, you must have fear, surprise, and intimidation by your side. For if any one element is lacking, then it would be best for you to retreat. You must break them before you engage them." This is the core reason why Grievous excels in combat. Fear cuts a Jedi off from the Force, and it's not just about keeping them from Force-pushing Grievous. When a Jedi cannot connect with the Force out of anxiety, then this ruins everything. Their lightsaber combat form is slow and sloppy, their reaction times are lacking, and they cannot focus enough to use their surroundings. Grievous is a lightning-fast machine described as moving faster than even Force sensitives can perceive. If his enemy has to face that threat, and they are also cut off from the Force, it becomes clear why so many of them fall before his blade. But this was not true with General Kenobi. Obi-Wan may not have had the most potent Force potential, but he had a strength of a different kind. Obi-Wan has strength of character, strength of determination, and a strength of will. His resolve was what allowed him to beat Lord Vader on Mustafar. It is what allowed him to become strong enough to match the Chosen One in a Force push contest. It's what allowed him to stop Maul, an assassin trained by Sidious himself while he was only a Padawan. The only person that intimidates Obi-Wan is Dooku, which is why he keeps losing. But in every other scenario, against every other opponent, Obi-Wan is unshakable. Dooku describes his presence in the Force as a window into a serene meadow. The Jedi Master has a way of becoming one with the Force in such a way that he can react without ever thinking about it. He literally hollows himself out and becomes a vessel for the Force to act through him. But even in times of high stress, Obi-Wan is the most fearless Jedi in the entire Order. It is the reason he is so well respected by the High Council, because even the staunch Ki-Adi-Mundi was afraid of Grievous. Dooku believes that Obi-Wan would prevail against the droid general not necessarily on a basis of skill alone, but because he knew that Grievous had no psychological advantage against the negotiator. This is all without mentioning Obi-Wan's battle IQ, which allowed him to snatch victory out of the jaws of defeat time and time again. There is a reason why Grievous specifically hates Obi-Wan so much. It is because he's the only Jedi that Grievous cannot break. Obi-Wan doesn't even seem bothered by him. But now it's time to talk about the next candidate, Mace Windu. But shockingly, Dooku could actually be wrong here according to Windu himself. A lot of what we mentioned about Obi-Wan can be applied to Windu as well. He's courageous, resolute, and extremely powerful. Grievous can intimidate a lot of people, but Windu is definitely not one of them. Being the Master of the Order, Windu is considered to be second only to Grandmaster Yoda in terms of power and skill. He and Dooku were colleagues during their days as Jedi Masters, and although Dooku has been on record of calling Mace Windu's lightsaber form sloppy, he never denies that Windu is a terrifying opponent to face. While Windu didn't see lightsaber combat often, he was exceptionally skilled, one of the finest fighters of his day and in all of history. Of course, the bantha in the room is that he pioneered the variant of Form 7 Juyo into allowing passion to inform the practitioner's blade work, making it random, erratic, unpredictable. It was a deadly and aggressive form that was created by Sith for Sith. Many Jedi believed that this was a form that fundamentally broke their code, and few were permitted to practice it. Windu, however, decided to make the aggressive form into something new. He had previously acknowledged that he had his own latent darkness within himself, an anger that threatened to consume him if it lay unchecked. But Windu refused to relent, or even compromise. He believed that this was a weakness, so instead, he decided to channel that energy in a way that would serve the light. And Vaapad was born. In the words of Windu, to use this form, a Jedi must give himself over to the thrill of battle, enjoying the fight and the satisfaction of winning. A Jedi must also accept and embrace the fury of his opponent. This transforms a Jedi into half of a superconducting loop, the other half being the power of darkness, which passes in and out of the Jedi without touching him. Vaapad is more than a fighting style. it is a state of mind. It is a path that leads through the penumbra of the dark side itself. Vapad is named so after a predatory creature with multiple tentacle-like limbs. Windu observed how a Vapad attacked by striking its prey with its tentacles so quickly that they were nothing but a blur. There was no way to tell how many tentacles the creature had until it was dead. And in the same way, Windu's blade would move so swiftly that it would appear as though he was attacking with 4 or even 8 lightsabers at once, eviscerating his opponent's defenses. Each attack was not simply wild, but was quick and deadly, meant to dismantle an enemy quickly and effectively. Dooku believed this style was too overwhelming for even Grievous, who used the exact same tactic, but with less finesse and with more brute force, and Dooku knew. With all of that said though, there was a time when Mace Windu fought Grievous, and it didn't end well. This was during the Battle of Coruscant when Windu engaged Grievous when he was attempting to escape. The two fought, and Grievous's cybernetic mind began to analyze and even copy Windu's style. The Jedi Master was so shocked by this, horrified, that he immediately broke off the engagement. He then considered Grievous's mimicry to be a passable copy of Vapad, something that he didn't think was possible, but something that made Grievous far too dangerous. It didn't matter if Grievous could not use the Force. If his mind could calculate the sequences of Vapad and mimic it to near perfection, use it the way that it was intended, the movements of Form 7 variant were still extremely deadly, and Mace Windu knew that if Grievous learned it, far more Jedi would die by the droid general. Because of this, Windu broke off the engagement entirely, and instead of dueling him again, Windu reached out with the Force and crushed the general's chest plate in an attempt to destroy his internal organs. The Master failed to kill Grievous with the Force as intended, but it did injure the cyborg's lungs, making him far less effective in combat later. So with that said, was Dooku incorrect? Well, not entirely. While Windu chose not to continue fighting with the lightsaber, he did successfully use the Force, and because he was brave enough in the mind, there was nothing that Grievous could do to stop him. Windu was almost successful in crushing Grievous's organs entirely, and it left him with a lasting wound. And I believed it was at least partially due to this injury that Obi-Wan was able to kill him on Utapau, slowing him down, allowing Obi-Wan to disarm him. So while he wasn't totally dismantled as Dooku said he would be by Windu, Grievous still suffered grave consequences from the encounter that may have indirectly led to his death. And the last Jedi that Dooku named, but certainly not the least, Grand Master Yoda. Does this one really even need an explanation? Yoda embodies 800 years of Jedi experience. He was a duelist so powerful that even Sidious could not overcome him. Yoda in fact did meet Grievous in the Canon comics, Marvel Yoda number 7, and made an absolute mockery of the droid general. Dooku was well aware of Yoda's skill considering how powerful the Grandmaster was, and that he was the individual that trained him. In his quote, Dooku literally says, "Stars help you," if Grievous were to encounter the Grandmaster. He says this because prayer would be the only thing that Grievous could reasonably do against Yoda. So we'll just leave him here. But what I wonder most is why does Dooku not count Anakin Skywalker among those that could take down Grievous? In Legends continuity, Dooku didn't actually know the true skills or the lightsaber forms of Anakin and Obi-Wan until the duel on the Invisible Hand. Up until that point, he had assumed that Kenobi was using Ataru, and Anakin was using Shien, the same form that he fought against him on Geonosis. Shien was the traditional version of Form 5. It leaned slightly more defensive, and focused more on blast deflection than duels, and while it could be used in lightsaber combat effectively, it was better against multiple opponents, and it was not recommended for one-on-one duels. Anakin's next form, Jem So, was far more suited for lightsaber combat, and was almost entirely offensive. Tyrannis had been currently unaware that Anakin had switched his combat style philosophy, and become obsessed with blade-to-blade dueling after he lost to Dooku. After his failure, Anakin even altered his own lightsaber design to feature a thicker hilt with more ridges, in order to facilitate the type of grip that Jem So required. Anakin Skywalker's weapon and lightsaber did not become a tool for peace, but a weapon of war. But Dooku assumed the boy continued practicing Shien like many other Jedi do, who refused to switch their styles to something more suited for blast deflection during the Clone Wars especially. Not to mention, Anakin continued to struggle with Ventress, and in Volume 3 of the Clone Wars comics, titled Rogue's Gallery, Grievous managed to dismantle and defeat Dirge and Ventress at the same time as a test from Dooku, proving that he was the strongest. So using ABC logic, the Count assumed that because Anakin struggled against Ventress, that he would not be able to stop Grievous. Now of course Skywalker did defeat Ventress once on Yavin 4, but that was not without great effort. The Sith Lord knew Anakin was stubborn, an impetuous boy that didn't easily learn from his mistakes. Skywalker himself quipped that he was a slow learner. And even though Anakin would not be frightened like the other Jedi, his recklessness would get him killed against Grievous. At least that's what Dooku assumed. Dooku assumed that Anakin would attack Grievous the same way that they had fought on Geonosis, that he would bum rush him, and be quickly felled by Grievous's dirty tricks. The bottom line is that Count Dooku 100% underestimated Anakin Skywalker. He truly did not grasp how powerful that he had become. And as we know, it would cost him more than his hands. But anyway, visitors of the archives will know that we absolutely love Dooku, and believe that he's one of the most underrated characters in Star Wars lore in terms of his raw strength and power in the Force, not to mention his mastery of the lightsaber. With that said though, there is somebody that we know that disagrees with us vehemently about Dooku's own skill compared to others such as Yoda or even Darth Sidious. That individual is Dooku himself, the Count of Sereno and the leader of the Separatist forces, not to mention a Dark Lord of the Sith. Dooku believed that his powers in the Force eclipsed that of his former master in Yoda. Dooku believed that his skill and his understanding of the Force was on a completely new level than that of his old master. Dooku believed in many ways that he had become what Yoda refused to be, what the Jedi was meant to be, and in Dooku's mind he was going to reform the Jedi Order, remake it in the image of the Empire and in the dark side. Dooku believed that he was wiser than Yoda, more skilled with the blade, and that his mastery and understanding of the Force eclipsed that of the old master. But why? What were the deeper intricacies on why Dooku believed that he had outgrown Yoda not only as a teacher, but also as an enemy? What about Dooku made him so much more powerful than Yoda in his own mindscape? Greetings, fellow searchers of knowledge of the Force, and welcome to the archives. Before we enter today's discussion, we have a massive sale for Cyber Monday. On the brand new Star Wars merch page, using code WAVE, you can get 15% already half off site-wide, so an additional 15% off your entire order. We've been trying to make larger videos with more editing, and the proceeds made by the merch page will be directly funneled back into the channel in order to improve on our larger scale videos that we would love to bring to you. Anyway guys, if you're interested, check the link in the description below. But with that said, let's open today's holocron. Dooku inherently believed that he was far more powerful than Yoda. His perspective was driven by his views on the Force, power, and his disillusionment with the Jedi, which Yoda represented. As a former Jedi Master, Dooku departed the Order because he felt it was corrupt, not living up to its potential. Dooku's beliefs were that the Jedi were bound to their rules and dogma, and that limited their understanding, and the true powers of the Force was just beyond their grasp, but that the Jedi in their current state would never even come close to their potential. Under the guidance of Sidious though, and furthered by his belief that he was stronger than Yoda naturally, Dooku believed that it was the Jedi code that held him back. Dooku saw himself as more willing to use the Force to its fullest extent, unconstrained by the Jedi's moral limitation. In his heart, Dooku still believed that Yoda was the greatest Jedi that had ever lived, but he even held more belief in his own sense of superiority. Dooku believed his understanding of the Force, especially after embracing the Sith, was more complete than that of Yoda's. Dooku believed that he could grow more powerful naturally than Yoda if he had stayed a Jedi, but he simply believed that it was his ability to accept a larger aspect of the Force, combining it with his Jedi teachings and the light side of the Force, to become what the Jedi were always meant to be, wielders of the light and the dark. This was rooted in Dooku's broader Sith philosophy, where power is seen as an essential means of bringing about change in the galaxy. Dooku viewed his path, which involved embracing the dark side, as a way to reshape the galaxy around him, contrasting with Yoda's passive approach, grounded in wisdom and the defense of peace. Dooku believed though that in order to bring about true peace in the future, you had to break peace in the present. And to Dooku, that peace was represented by the Jedi Code, attachment to the principles of peace and non-aggression. The belief shaped Dooku's view that Yoda was unable to grasp the depth of the Force, only reaching the surface level with the light side and what the Jedi were willing to teach. Dooku saw a wealth of knowledge and abilities that the Jedi simply refused to touch, and he believed this as pure ignorance. There are key points that Dooku thought were weaknesses in Yoda's approach: his Jedi dogma, his limited view of the Force. He believed the commitment to peace, defense, and the refusal to use the Force aggressively as a limitation, a misunderstanding of what the Force had given him, the ability to enact change. Dooku believed that inherently the Jedi did not understand the true purpose of the dark side, which made them less capable of dealing with the true nature of power and control. To Dooku, Yoda's focus on balance and peace made him blind. There was no balance and peace in the reality of the galaxy. Dooku believed that this required strength, and even that it meant using the dark side to attain that strength. Dooku essentially saw this wealth of power and knowledge, and he was confused as to why individuals like Yoda would not take a step down that path to reshape the galaxy for a more peaceful and an understanding era, to become a dictator, to sacrifice one's own soul in the pursuit of a better galaxy. Dooku saw Yoda as an individual that was powerful but was reluctant to act decisively when necessary. Dooku believed that Yoda's reluctance to embrace power was a flaw, as he had experienced firsthand how the dark side could provide clarity and decisiveness, something that Dooku had always felt he lacked as a Jedi, and something that the dark side imbued within him, giving him a newfound sense of confidence and fulfillment. While Yoda rejected the dark side for its destructive potential, Dooku felt that the dark side offered an ultimate path to control and strength, one that Yoda, due to his beliefs, failed to understand. Dooku believed that the dark side was there for the Jedi to use, that the Jedi were yet to reach their perfect enlightened form. Yoda was hesitant in battle. In their duel in Attack of the Clones, Dooku demonstrated his confidence, his superiority by challenging Yoda directly. And even though in this moment Yoda prevailed, Dooku still believed that he was right, that Yoda's respect for life, even his enemies' lives, was a weakness that would prevent him from ever defeating the Sith and embracing his own potential. The Count's belief in his superiority over Yoda was not just about physical power and power in the Force, but most importantly, Dooku thought that his ideology was more powerful than that of Yoda's. His philosophy. He saw Yoda's commitment to the Jedi's restraint and peace as making him incapable of wielding true power. He believed that the Force refused to grant Yoda the true power that it now granted Dooku. Dooku is a Sith, but after joining the Sith, he had a very complex view of the Force that was not common for their order. This was shaped by both being a Jedi and a Dark Lord. His transition to the dark side was driven by disillusionment and a lack of trust. He saw the dark side as empowerment and realism. Dooku said that the dark side of the Force to him represented freedom. Unlike many other Sith, Dooku's embrace of the dark side was not purely out of a lust for power and hatred, which makes Dooku himself extremely complex. Dooku believed that the dark side of the Force was a necessary step to dismantle what he saw as corruption within the Republic, and for the failures of the Jedi. It even stems from him, again ideologically, believing he is superior. As an aristocrat, Dooku's perspective aligned with the authoritarian structure of the Sith inherently. Dooku thought that strong leadership was essential for peace, which he thought the light side of the Force failed to achieve alone. But his opinion on the light side, unlike Sidious, was not that of hatred. As a Jedi Master, Dooku had upheld the values of the light side. However, his experiences with political corruption and the Jedi Council's perceived ineffectiveness caused Dooku to doubt the light side's utility in achieving any meaningful change. He considered the Jedi to be overly idealistic and optimistic, out of touch with the realities of the galaxy. He saw their commitment to peace and detachment as a limitation, something that rendered them incapable of addressing a larger systemic issue. While fully embracing the dark side of the Force and becoming a Dark Lord of the Sith, Dooku retained a respect for aspects of Jedi teachings that many other Sith Lords lacked. Dooku's shift was not about the outright rejection of the light side of the Force, but more about prioritizing the dark side's practicality, the effectiveness in achieving his goal. Like many Sith though, his reliance on the dark side ultimately would consume him, leading to arrogance, betrayal, and eventually his own downfall. Dooku's nuanced perspective makes him one of the more complex characters in all of the Star Wars saga. His belief in the dark side as a means to an end distinguishes him from other Sith, those that seek power simply for power's sake. And that is why Dooku is one of my favorite characters in all of Star Wars lore. And in the end, why he believed that he was more powerful than Grandmaster Yoda. But anyway guys, I hope you found this video enlightening and interesting. Most of us will agree that Dooku was incorrect, that Yoda's resilience and a true, layered, deep understanding of the Jedi way and the light side of the Force made him more powerful than Dooku, who fell into arrogance and an eventual lust for power above anything else, even peace. But hearing Dooku's thoughts are still really compelling, and gives us a look into the mind of a man who maybe ideologically originally didn't align with that of the Sith, but viewed them as a necessary evil, an evil that would corrupt and poison his soul. The soul that was once a good, valiant Jedi Master. But anyway, guys, Force users that existed during the time of the Clone Wars, Dooku was easily among the most dangerous and powerful. While Sidious may have been the strongest Sith Lord, he operated within the shadows, rarely coming out of hiding to do anything himself. But for a significant period of the war, whenever Dooku was on the move, it was only the Grand Master and Yoda who stood a chance at defeating him. This was, of course, until Dooku's age got the better of him, and Anakin Skywalker's power increased. But before Anakin was inducted into the Jedi Order as its most talented Padawan, that accolade had once belonged to a young Dooku. And in today's holocron, we want to ask a very simple question. Had Dooku not died to Anakin's blade, could he have possibly grown to surpass even Darth Sidious? Well, we have found something truly shocking, and truthfully believe that now within the lore, Dooku could be substantially more powerful than we previously anticipated. So greetings again, students of the Force, and welcome to the Archives. Our goal today is to have a factual discussion about Dooku's power, skill, and potential to see if in another timeline he could have grown to the level where he could challenge Sidious for the position as Lord of the Sith. We ask a lot of you to humor this video, as although it may seem far-fetched at first, Dooku has been repeatedly stated in lore to have been one of the most talented Jedi of not only the era, but in the Order's history. This was outright stated in the novel for Revenge of the Sith. In fact, we have several references which speak to Dooku's insane potential. Master Thame, one of Dooku's own teachers in Legends continuity, once commented that Dooku was the most talented Padawan that he had ever seen. And this was something that Yoda often corroborated. In Yoda Dark Rendezvous, Yoda once commented to the High Council that he considered Dooku to be the Jedi's strongest and its wisest student, and that he was the most learned in the ways of the Force. Despite this being at a time when Dooku had turned to the dark side, none of the council members disagreed with Yoda, including Windu. Yoda thought extremely highly of his Padawan's potential, and in the Attack of the Clones illustrated guide, it was stated that Dooku's power made him enigmatic to Yoda. And to finish all of this off, we are told in Star Wars Insider number 113 that had Dooku not departed from the Jedi Order, eventually he would have become a master on par with the level of Yoda, and a worthy applicant for the Grand Master. His Jedi potential was maddeningly high, which was why it was such a travesty when he embraced the dark side. As Darth Tyranus, his power gained a significant boost. This allowed him to essentially come close to defeating Yoda in a confrontation of the Force, and then with the lightsaber. There were a ton of factors going into this though, such as limited time for Dooku, and perhaps had they kept fighting, Yoda would have come out on top due to his superior knowledge and experience. But on a basis of power alone, we know Yoda was shocked at what his apprentice had become. At the time of Attack of the Clones, George Lucas even stated that Yoda and Dooku were essentially equal in power in terms of their force ability. It was actually the Battle of Geonosis that let Yoda know just how strong Darth Sidious was, which made the Grand Master extremely worried. Tyrannus had been so strong that it made the Council doubt whether or not Sidious even existed, as they could not fathom anyone beyond Dooku, especially without them knowing about it, because this would mean that Sidious would have been stronger than perhaps even Yoda if Dooku and Yoda were truly equal here. When Maul returned from the Clone Wars, Windu firmly stated that Darth Tyranus was his master, and that Maul was the apprentice, which is told to us in the Son of Dathomir comic. What is absolutely terrifying about Dooku though, may give credence to his ability to reach Palpatine's level. This is where, for a brief period of time during the middle of the Clone Wars, Dooku gained even more power, even more than he had in Attack of the Clones. This was when he began his Sith holocron collection, and a particular one known as the Dark Holocron ended up increasing his strength in the dark side exponentially. The Dark Holocron was an ancient artifact that was retrieved by Jedi Master Odan from one of Naga Sadow's ships. It was the first holocron that the Jedi ever found, and to this day it is unknown who crafted it. But although its constructor is unknown, its contents are not, enhancing anyone who studied it. Not to mention, as an apprentice of the Rule of Two, Dooku had access to a ton of Sith knowledge from those that had come before. We know that at some point, he became obsessed with Sith lore himself, and just like Sidious, he studied it obsessively. According to the Book of the Sith, Sidious encouraged Dooku to study one Sith in particular. That Sith Lord was Darth Bane. If we examine the Book of the Sith ourselves, this would mean that Dooku had access to the knowledge of how to transcend the feelings of pain, enhancing his body to produce flame-like heat, to use his fists as deadly weapons, to drain the heat out of another, freezing them even from the inside out using the Force. The Force was opened up to Dooku on a level that he had not seen before. Whether or not Dooku could perform this is another question though. Dooku still though did have the knowledge of Force Drain, an ability to cast it around himself, producing essentially a field of death for the Force. Along with that, Dooku had the power of the mind, such as Force Insanity. He could blind others with his mental tactics. He could memory walk and mind shard. All of this was literally the act of mentally splitting an opponent's mind, racking them with pain, cutting them off from the Force. Using these powers, Dooku circumvented all of the tricks of the Jedi, which was why he was so good at torturing them. This is why Quinlan Vos fell to the dark side under Dooku. We also know that Dooku performed Sith alchemy with Sidious in the Clone Wars, and the fact that he created 2 near-perfect doppelgangers in Legends, doppelgangers that would fight Anakin Skywalker, gives us a good idea at just how learned Dooku was, along with his natural latent talent. Technically, if we go based on what we have seen and shown from Dooku before in the lore, this would mean that for a brief period of time, he may have been stronger than Yoda, especially if we take into account what George Lucas said. Sidious during this was extremely wary of Dooku. We haven't even talked about Dooku's saber skill yet, and Palpatine was growing concerned. He was having to keep his apprentice watched in order to both protect himself and the Sith Grand Plan. This was the main reason why he commanded Dooku to eliminate Ventress. If Tyranus had too many allies, Sidious would be in real trouble. But alone, could Tyranus actually have one day challenged Sidious for the title? Well, my friends, the answer is no. Dooku is indeed one of the most powerful Force users of this era, but he was still less than Sidious will always be. What we described was Dooku at the apex of his power, being around 80 to 82 years old. But by the time Dooku was 83, he had significantly weakened from the war. All of that titanic power had come at a cost, which was his vitality. We talked about this in a previous video, but Dooku was incredibly weak by the time of his death due to dark side degradation. This is the ravaging of the flesh that occurs to all dark side practitioners. Dooku had become a Sith Lord at the age of 70, and had spent simply too much of his life as a Jedi. When he joined Sidious, all of that immense power in the light that he had built up was keeping him healthy. But this would all flip with a switch. When he embraced the dark side, he got a massive boost in power, but it destroyed his already old body. Dooku did not live in the darkness as Sidious had. Sidious was born of the dark side, and therefore, Dooku's dark side degradation was accelerated. In the lore, we believe that Sidious passed Yoda and Dooku in power 20 years prior to Revenge of the Sith, when he killed his master Darth Plagueis. In the Darth Plagueis novel, it is implied that Sidious got a 10x increase in power when he elevated from apprentice to master. The dark side selected him as its representative, which instantly granted Palpatine so much power that he thought that he would be unable to absorb it. By the time of 19 BBY, while Dooku was starting to go downhill, Sidious's power was still growing. He would only go on to increase his power over the next 20 years, and the Dark Lord handled Yoda during their confrontation in the Senate Hall. No, he could not beat the Grandmaster blade to blade, but it has been explicitly told through several sources that Sidious was superior to Yoda in the Force, which only makes sense if Yoda and Dooku were equal. Even with Dooku's elevated power thanks to the Clone Wars, we saw Sidious easily force choke him through a hologram. Had Dooku kept on living, it wouldn't have made him better, it would have made him worse. Even if Dooku did discover the knowledge of how to keep himself fresh in the body as Sidious had, it would be too little too late. As harsh as it all sounds, by the time Anakin killed Dooku, Tyrannis had already peaked and had officially outlived his usefulness. It's all a real shame, truthfully. Had Dooku chosen one path or the other much earlier in life, he could have been Sidious's legitimate equal. And on the other side of the same coin, had he remained a Jedi, he could have exceeded the power of Yoda, or perhaps matched him as Grand Master. Darth Plagueis had once played with the idea of Dooku being a backup apprentice should Sidious fail. Had he been taken into the Sith around that era, the story could be very different, making Dooku and Sidious legitimate rivals to the Sith throne. But Dooku instead reached just shy of his greatest potential, not only as a Sith Lord, but also as a Jedi. And that is why we believe that Dooku could not surpass Palpatine, even if he were allowed to live on. Simply put, Sidious's power is in a completely different plane. But Tyrannis is absolutely no slouch, and had a lot of things gone his way, he could have been more powerful. We can count on our fingers how many people really rival Yoda in strength, and for Dooku to be among them is no small feat. But as always, one of the most defining moments of Anakin's fall to the dark side was when he finally got revenge on Dooku, executing the man in cold blood. This moment was after the Sith Lord had goaded him into using his anger, but found that he was unable to defend against the fury that was unleashed. The coup de grace came with one scissor snip of lightsabers in Anakin's hands. In the moment after he committed the act, Anakin Anakin only looked more unsure of himself. However, in the Revenge of the Sith novel, we get an extremely detailed look into Anakin's mind and how this act greatly troubled him. In fact, for the rest of his time on Coruscant, Anakin would be haunted by this singular moment, racked with shame and guilt that no words of justification could ever mask. So why is this? What were Anakin's thoughts as he struggled with his first steps in the dark side and the death of Dooku? Well, join us today as we open a holocron and untangle the complicated mind of Anakin Skywalker. Now, let us begin. At the moment of the kill, to Anakin's perceptions, none of it ever seemed real. The novel tells us that he feels like he was within a dream, one where anything and everything was okay, and he would be justified. Anakin felt correct to take revenge on the man who had taken his arm, the man who had brought a war upon the galaxy which cost the lives of millions. Dooku, a once great Jedi, had become a Sith Lord, and a terror for those who fought alongside him. Now Anakin had this man reduced to a handless prisoner. His hesitation was only a product of his Jedi training, but that all came crumbling down with 2 words of permission given by the Chancellor: do it. But after the deed was done, and Anakin came back to his senses, he was horrified at what he had done. He actually doubts his humanity for a moment, as he feels extremely far removed from the person that he believed that he was, a Jedi. This is what the novel reads. The murderer blinked again. Who am I? Was he the slave boy on a desert planet, valued for his astounding gift with machines? Was the legendary pod racer the only human to survive that deadly sport? Was he the unruly, high-spirited, trouble-prone student of a great Jedi Master? Was he the star pilot, the hero, the lover, the Jedi? Could he be all of these things? Could he be any of them and still have done what he had done here? The dramatic storm of thoughts in Anakin's mind shows how he literally felt himself slipping away. He pulled back and sputtered something about not being able to stop himself. He shouldn't have done that, staring down at the corpse of his own kill. The Jedi in Anakin immediately knew that he had done something wrong. This caused guilt to flush over him like an ocean, one that he was now drowning beneath. The Chancellor began to speak softly to him, telling him revenge was only natural after what Dooku had done. In the book, Palpatine even goes on to say that revenge is the foundation of justice. However, while Anakin feels a little better, the words of justification could only sink so far in his being. We can clearly see that Anakin is genuinely a good person, one that was pushed too far out of himself by the dark side. And now that Anakin has returned, he is appalled at the actions of Darth Vader. This was a choice he now can never unchoose, and in this moment, he remembers the words of Master Windu. There are no second chances. Speaking of Windu, he would be the first Jedi to hear about this once Anakin returned to Coruscant. Obi-Wan had only determined Anakin's victory after waking up upon his back, dangling in an elevator shaft. He hadn't known that the success had been at the cost of Anakin's humanity. Obi-Wan believed that Anakin had done the act as a true Jedi and was praising him to Windu. Windu at first was shocked and joyous. His mind ran through the implications of the news of Dooku's death. Dooku was to the Separatists what Palpatine represented to the Republic. Without him, all of the Separatist factions would shatter and dissolve in a matter of weeks. The war was over, or at least this was close to the end. However, in Windu's own inner celebration, this faded quickly when he saw the look on Anakin's face. He picked up on how unhappy and ashamed Skywalker was, and Windu was now suspicious. But interestingly, the rest of the council did not share in his dubiousness. They were all too excited because they saw this as a sign that Anakin was beginning to fulfill his destiny. One Sith Lord down, one more to go, and Skywalker was going to be the one to do it. Hence the off-the-books mission of Anakin spying upon the Chancellor, trying to get close. Meanwhile, Anakin himself wanted anything else but to be on Coruscant. Here, he was constantly reminded about what he had done, and for the next few weeks, he would be haunted by the death of Dooku, believing that he was becoming a different person, losing who he was. The guilt of it all choked him whenever he was trying to enjoy himself with Padme. Anakin's feelings worsened when he began having the dreams about Padme, which led to him not getting any sleep. When the day came that he was elected to be upon the council, at that same moment, he was denied the rank of Master. Anakin's fears had come true. The novelization tells us that the moment Anakin spoke out in anger against the council, it wasn't Anakin speaking, but that Dooku's killer had taken control, Darth Vader. And when he came back to his senses, Anakin was embarrassed and ashamed, just as he had when Dooku fell. It's fascinating to watch Anakin struggle with this kind of feeling. He around this time was accustomed to being on the front lines of a war. He had faced down many enemies, and even had to deliver swift justice upon them, such as when he stabbed Tal Merrick through the back. But that time, just like the rest, Anakin had reason to use lethal force. Merrick was about to blow up Duchess Satine's ship with all of the senators and ambassadors aboard. Obi-Wan and Satine could do nothing, so Anakin acted, and he was not sorry. There have even been plenty of times Anakin engaged someone in a duel, and he had lethal intent, such as when he faced Dooku on Naboo. But the difference is that Anakin in these situations may have been acting out of anger, but he was still the Jedi hero. It was a righteous fury that drove him in this moment to do whatever was necessary to end the war and ensure the safety of those around him. Anakin was not a killer. Even when he's acted out of darkness, he rarely allows himself to go as far as to end a life. But just as the Tusken Raiders haunted Anakin, now too did Dooku. Anakin reveals in his thoughts that the reason why Dooku's death on the Invisible Hand stuck with him so profoundly was because Anakin had an opportunity to bring Dooku in alive and preserve that life. He was an unarmed prisoner, no longer a threat to anything or anyone, but for an unprompted, unprovoked reason, Anakin beheaded him in a very un-Jedi-like manner. This was the act of Vader, the Jedi hero Anakin, imprisoned by his own anger. Anakin's feelings for this moment carry over to the duel in the Chancellor's office between Windu and Palpatine. When Windu realized just how powerful Sidious was, and how much of a hold he had on Anakin, he knew that to bring Sidious to trial would mean nothing. It would be a joke. Palpatine had control of the Senate and the courts, and for all he knew, the destruction of the Jedi had already begun, and now the Chosen One was coming to the man's defense. Mace Windu had to kill Palpatine. Execution may not have been the Jedi way, but this was warranted. But that is not how Anakin saw it. Haunted by the memory of Dooku, he believed this was the same situation. Blinded by Palpatine's manipulation, Dooku was only a small part of Anakin's feelings, as he believed he needed Palpatine to stay alive to save Padme. It's important to remember that Anakin's killing of Dooku was not a byproduct of his turn to the dark side, but far more important, a deliberate stepping stone towards that end. Many things would have changed had Anakin elected mercy. Falling to the dark side is not an affliction, but a series of choices, and for Anakin, that began as far back as the Tusken Raiders, continued on with Dooku, and was fulfilled when he betrayed Mace Windu. However, that's not to say that he immediately turned evil, as right up until the moment that he became Vader, Anakin Skywalker loathed the dark side within himself, and what he had done to cause its rise to power. What reaction did General Grievous have to the death of Dooku? And why was he strangely excited and pleased, while also obviously disappointed and frightened? Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the archives. Tyranus was a constant in the life of Grievous after his cybernetic transformation. The Count would train him to be the ultimate killer of the Jedi, exploring the ins and outs of the lightsaber combat. Despite this, and the promises Dooku made to Grievous about helping him exact vengeance on the Jedi, the two didn't exactly have a good relationship. Neither one attempted to hide their disdain for the other, with Dooku believing Grievous was no more than a rabid monster, and Grievous viewing Dooku as an irritating but a necessary tool for his ambitions, a necessary trainer. However, right at the end of the third year of the Clone War, an unexpected surprise hit the war effort. During the Separatist moment of triumph over Coruscant, Dooku falls dead at the hand of Anakin Skywalker. So what happened after Grievous first found out about his master's death? His thoughts and feelings were a lot more complicated than one may expect. So let's begin and open a holocron. Before we begin though, we have had a terrible vision through the Force. Many of the individuals who use our archives are not yet subscribed to our order, so if you've been enjoying the daily holocron uploads, reach out and crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny, we have foreseen it. The moment Grievous realized that Dooku had died during the Battle of Coruscant was actually an awkward one. He had been in communication with a young Republic officer during a ceasefire. The droid general demanded that the officer tell his superiors to move their ships out of the way and allow him to jump to hyperspace. Otherwise, he threatened to disembowel the Chancellor live on the HoloNet. The young officer insisted that Grievous show him the Chancellor so that he knew that Grievous was not bluffing. The general scoffed at the command, and told his comm officer to patch him through to Dooku. The comm officer said that Dooku wasn't responding at that moment, and there, Grievous insisted that he bring up the security feed of the quarters where the Chancellor and Dooku were being held. But once the comm officer did so, he suggested that Grievous take a look first. And this is what the novelization for Revenge of the Sith reads. The plain urgency of his tone brought Grievous to his side without another word. The general bent over the screen that showed the view inside his quarters, and found himself looking at a jumbled piles of energy-sheared wreckage surrounding the empty shape of the general's chair. And that looked like it could have been a body, draped in a cape of armor weave. After seeing the hollow feed of Dooku's body, Grievous stumbles to attempt to tell the Republic officer that the Chancellor was indisposed at that moment. The officer calls the general's bluff and tells him that he has 10 minutes to surrender before he opened fires. After that, the Republic cuts communication, and this is what the novel reads. When Grievous turned to the bridge security officer, his mask was blankly expressionless as ever, but he made up for it with the open murder in his voice. Dooku is dead, and the Jedi are loose. They have the Chancellor. Find them and bring them to me. His armor-plast fingers curled into a fist that crashed down on the security console so hard that the entire thing collapsed into a sparking, smoking ruin. Find them now. While the novel doesn't give us much to go off of when it comes to his initial reaction, we make our own assessments by reading between the lines and further in the novel. Grievous's first reactions is clearly shock and anger. Having been trained by Tyrannis, Grievous is clearly overcome with astonishment that anyone besides Lord Sidious could best the Count in personal combat. Given how strong of a duelist Dooku was, Grievous knew from his personal experience that no average Jedi, in the General's opinion, could ever conceivably come close to Dooku. While he never really liked his master, Grievous respected the Count for how powerful of a warrior he was. Being of the Kaleesh, he was a warrior race like the Mandalorians, and Grievous begrudgingly respects anyone who knows how to fight. And of course, after numerous sessions of being defeated again and again by Dooku, it didn't seem like a possibility in Grievous's mind that he could just go down so simply. Not to mention, the two men that were responsible, Kenobi and Skywalker, were loose. If Dooku was dead, then Grievous knew that he was next. This was why he didn't even bother engaging the two Jedi once they reached the command bridge. His immediate thought was to retreat, so the next emotion would be pure anger brought about by his fear from the Jedi, something that he hated within himself. Much later though, Grievous would finally have a meeting on Utapau with Lord Sidious. Here, we get to understand a little bit more about what was going on through Grievous's mind once all the action had died out. We know of their interaction in Revenge of the Sith, when Grievous inquires about the loss of Dooku, to which Palpatine states that this was a necessary sacrifice. Surprising to Grievous, he would later reiterate this point in another holo message that the two share in the novel that is not present in the film. The book reads as follows. Grievous says, "Master, if I may trouble you with my boldness, why did you not let me kill Chancellor Palpatine? We may never get a better chance." Palpatine responds, "The time was not yet ripe. Patience, my general. The end of the war is near, and victory is certain." Even with the loss of Dooku, Grievous responds, "Dooku was not lost. He was sacrificed. A strategic sacrifice, as one offers up a piece into Jarek to draw the opponent into one fatal blunder. I was never much the Jarek player, my master," Grievous said. "I prefer real war. And you shall have your fill, I promise you. The fatal blunder you speak of, if I may once again trouble you with my boldness, you will come to understand soon enough." Grievous could hear the smile in his master's voice. "All will be clear once you meet my new apprentice." From these interactions, Grievous was far less concerned with the loss of Dooku than he was with how it would impact the Separatist movement. Dooku was the political figurehead of the Confederacy. He was their face, their voice to the galaxy. This made him a sort of binding glue to hold the entire movement together. His brave words and charisma not only kept the CIS emboldened towards their goal, but was also their spokesperson to the Republic. Without Dooku, all Separatist morale would tank, meaning that funding would be pulled as the Trade Federation and the Techno Union would abandon their support. This possibility meant no more droids, no more ships, no more armies, and no more war. This is, unless Grievous was able to take that position as the leader of the movement. While the risk of Dooku's death were noticeable, the general was at least pleased that his ambitions were paying off. Now Grievous was the leader of the Confederacy. He was the one in command, and he was finally speaking directly to Lord Sidious. Dooku was not in his way, and Grievous considered this the ultimate honor. This was a massive promotion for Grievous, as now he was gaining the power that he needed for his own goals. In short, the secondary reaction that Grievous had was that he was pleased with moving up the ranks and privileges, but Grievous was aware of his new responsibilities as the leader, some of which he was not entirely suited for, and he knew it. Grievous was no political public icon, and certainly did not have the charisma that Dooku had. He could not embolden the Confederacy, he would frighten them. But luckily for Grievous, he believed that he wouldn't need to do this. Grievous cared little for Dooku, or even the Separatist movement, or even the Sith, but what he did care about was the war effort against the Jedi. By 19 BBY, the Separatists were losing the war, and it may not have looked that way to the Republic due to Grievous's strategic fear-inducing military strikes, but if you actually look at the facts of the war, the CIS were on the back foot. The Jedi and the Republic forces were deeply entrenched in a period of time known as the Outer Rim Sieges, and during this era in the war, the Republic was actually on the Separatist doormat, as they had launched many successful but grueling assaults on the core Confederate stronghold worlds. The attack on Coruscant had been a desperate strike against the fortitude of the Republic's people. It was a move to stoke the fear and to make it look like the Republic was losing, but in reality, the Separatists were on the brink of defeat. The loss of Dooku was far more catastrophic to the Confederate war effort than many realized. Grievous was now backed into a corner and had to remain in hiding on Utapau, forced to wait for the alleged Hail Mary that Sidious had promised all of them in a new apprentice, one far younger and more powerful. Little did Grievous know that just like Dooku, he had outlived his usefulness, and he too would prove to be a strategic sacrifice. Obi-Wan Kenobi has gained a reputation in recent years as the man to go to when a Sith Lord needs to be taken care of. Starting his career as a Padawan, he defeated Darth Maul on Naboo after the assassin managed to kill his Jedi Master. And even when Maul returned, he failed time and time again to take down Kenobi until his inevitable end on Tatooine, again at the hand of the Jedi Master. Other enemies such as General Grievous, while not a Sith, still had the threat of one, and yet also fell to Kenobi's hand. The disfigurement of the powerful Lord Vader was also the handiwork of Obi-Wan, and last, but certainly not least, was the mutilation and humiliation of Asherad Het, who would later become the one Sith Darth Krayt. Obi-Wan is a man with quite the reputation under his belt as one who can handle a Sith Lord. However, many mistakenly believe that he is the Sith killer in all of the lore, the greatest. But unfortunately, there is one Dark Lord of the Sith that Obi-Wan cannot ever hope to defeat and never did, and that man was Count Dooku. So join us today as we open a holocron and analyze exactly why Dooku is the single person, maybe besides Darth Sidious, that Obi-Wan could never defeat. For many people, the discourse surrounding the Kenobi vs. Dooku matchup hinges on the fact that Anakin was able to beat Dooku, and Obi-Wan defeated Anakin. Therefore, he should be able to handle Darth Tyranus if he can defeat the Chosen One. However, this is not the case. Star Wars does not follow the ABC power scaling logic when it comes to character matchups, in terms of their individual styles, force abilities, and psychological effects that one person has on the other. Duels can go in a number of different ways. While Obi-Wan can defeat Anakin, that's for an entirely different reason than him being more skilled or more powerful. In fact, the reason why his perpetual victories over his former Padawan are so impactful is actually because, by all accounts, Obi-Wan should not have been able to defeat Anakin at all. That's what makes this duel so compelling. His fight with Vader on Mustafar was a losing battle from the moment they ignited their lightsabers. Obi-Wan was always on the back foot, and his death was not an if, but a when. However, Obi-Wan snatched victory out of the jaws of defeat because he knew Anakin's lightsaber style better than anyone else. Even though his raw power was oppressive, Obi-Wan's familiarity with how Anakin fought kept him alive until the infamous high ground moment, where Obi-Wan used his knowledge of Anakin's arrogance against him. Dooku was almost always able to defeat Anakin throughout the Clone War, but each and every time they met, Anakin grew stronger and stronger, getting ever closer to defeating the Count. In their final two matchups, the one on Naboo and the one on Obadiah, Anakin clearly has Dooku on the back foot, and the Sith Lord is only able to get the upper hand due to his power in the dark side and his quick thinking. But by the time of their final confrontation on the Invisible Hand, Anakin had the advantage in raw power due to Dooku's advanced age. In the Revenge of the Sith novel, even before the duel, Dooku was complaining that he felt every day of his 83 years. He was not 100% when he fought Anakin, and he goaded Anakin into using the dark side, causing him to get beat down by this raw, overpowering strength. And all of this analysis is without taking into account the type of advantages of lightsaber forms they all use. Anakin's Gem So countered Dooku's Makashi, but Obi-Wan's Sarisu provided him with more survivability against Anakin. The key difference though with Obi-Wan is that he doesn't have raw power in the Force, not on the level of someone like Anakin or Dooku, but rather, he needed to rely on training and honing his skill. Obi-Wan versus Anakin was a battle of talent versus hard work, but unfortunately in the skill department, Dooku always has outclassed Kenobi. He was a man trained by Yoda directly, who studied the art of the blade ever since he could hold one. He had mastered Form 2 of lightsaber combat to a higher degree than anyone in history, anyone in the Jedi Order, and he was able to rival Dooku's skill in Form 4, who had at 10 times the lifespan and experience of the younger Dooku. Even Sidious, who placed little stock in lightsaber dueling, found himself concerned about Dooku's raw talent. Obi-Wan, while an undoubtedly amazing duelist, just didn't have that kind of experience, and never would. He trained in Ataru most of his life under Qui-Gon Jinn, who kept him in the basics of the form for nearly 6 years. Granted, this gave Obi-Wan a solid foundation in lightsaber combat that made learning other forms much easier for him, and it's notable that by the time he fought Dooku in the Clone Wars, he had only been training in Sarisu for around 3 years. While his skill with the form was admirable to the point of receiving accolades from the High Council, there is a massively huge gap in experience between Kenobi and Dooku. Dooku can surgically pick apart Obi-Wan's style in a matter of moments. Obi-Wan was taught by the two people that Dooku knew the best, Yoda and Qui-Gon. On Geonosis, he manhandled Obi-Wan's Ataru like it was less than nothing, downing Obi-Wan in exactly 32 seconds. This loss was so traumatic, and a complete loss, that Obi-Wan completely retooled his lightsaber form. Obi-Wan's power would then rise as the Clone Wars broke out, along with the rest of the Jedi. But he and Anakin saw a unique surge. The next time that Obi-Wan would meet Dooku in open combat would be on Obadiah, where he fought him alongside Anakin. At this moment, for whatever reason, Obi-Wan was not confident enough in Sarisu at first, and actually tried to engage Dooku with Makashi ever so briefly. This proved to be a horrible mistake, as Dooku easily fends off his own form, effortlessly keeping Obi-Wan away and even kicking him towards the edge. Obi-Wan then goes back to using Sarisu, but by now, Dooku has already won and has pinned him. From that point forward, Tyranus expertly puts Anakin and Obi-Wan's synergy against them, forcing them to fight at their weakest. He relentlessly attacks Anakin, making him go on the defense where his form is weaker, and simultaneously, Dooku weaves and blocks Kenobi, forcing him to go on the attack where his form is weaker. We've talked about how Obi-Wan is an expert at Sarisu because he doesn't just defend, but he supplements it with offensive maneuvers, making it an extremely strong and a well-balanced style. However, Dooku has already proven that if Obi-Wan uses Ataru, he would basically be risking his life by playing into a trap. The only time Obi-Wan had a fair chance against Dooku was on the Invisible Hand. In the novel for Revenge of the Sith, Dooku was shocked and terrified of Obi-Wan's mastery of Form 3, as he hadn't seen it in its full glory up until that point, not just by Obi-Wan, but by anybody. He mentions how Obi-Wan spins his lightsaber in a defensive shell so bewilderingly fast that if Dooku attempted to attack, then he would be disarmed by the sheer speed of Obi-Wan's blade. But by this point, it was unfortunately too late. Dooku, while weak in his old age, had grown insurmountably strong with the dark side, so he overpowered Obi-Wan with the Force itself. First by pushing him back so that he could focus on Anakin, and second by lifting him up by the throat and taking him out of the fight entirely. Once Dooku realized Obi-Wan's blade skill was now a threat, he just didn't bother engaging him at the sword at all, at least not while Anakin was there bearing down on him. Now that we've actually dissected the forms, skills, and powers of Kenobi and Dooku though, let's talk about the most important part, the psychology of the two men. The real reason why Obi-Wan can never defeat Dooku is because Obi-Wan fears him more than any other person in the galaxy. One might think Obi-Wan is more afraid of Maul, but that's not the case. Obi-Wan still holds the swagger in their interactions due to the fact that he knows he has defeated Maul before. He is not as refined as Dooku is. Kenobi has never so much as come close to defeating Dooku at any point in any duel. Every time they engage, Obi-Wan is already intimidated and allowing self-doubt to seep in. Of everybody that Dooku fights, his Dunmok technique, the ability to penetrate one's mind and instill them with doubt and fear, was most perfectly utilized against Obi-Wan. And this all comes down to legacy. Dooku is basically Obi-Wan's grandfather. Obi-Wan respects the skills and wisdom of Yoda and Qui-Gon, and Dooku is the bridge and the gap between that legacy. This carries an immense amount of weight in Obi-Wan's mind. The one question that he thinks whenever they engage is, how can I defeat the student of the Grand Master, and the master of my own master? Beyond this, Obi-Wan is terrified of Dooku's power and skill. He was first traumatized by his and Anakin's mutilation on Geonosis. Whenever Obi-Wan visited the cursed Sith world of Zygula, the planet tortured him with memories of that moment over and over again, of memories of Dooku. He does his best to push past that fear, but it doesn't help that every time that he sees Dooku, the man is seeped deeper in the dark side, more monstrous and more cruel. In the Son of Dathomir comics, Dooku and Maul briefly team up against Sidious when Dooku is possessed, but during their plans, Obi-Wan, Tipli, Windu, and Aayla Secura all show up to stop them. Obi-Wan and Master Tipli briefly engage Dooku, who simply fends them off with Force Lightning, but then he uses the Force to easily tear through Tipli's Force shield, bringing her closer to him, and then gutting her with his lightsaber, all while Obi-Wan watches helplessly. In the next frame, we can see just how utterly mortified Obi-Wan is, as he is seen screaming Tipli's name before crying. He's not filled with rage, he's filled with fear. All in all, even if skill and raw talent were not a factor in this relationship, Obi-Wan is constantly distressed by the amount of fear and intimidation that he feels towards Dooku. This will always hinder his ability to fight properly. And that, in the end, is why Dooku is the one Sith Lord that Obi-Wan never bested, and why the man whose speciality is Sith Lords never conquered Darth Tyranus. But anyway,
Why did Luke say that he believed Darth Tyranus was pure evil?
Welcome back, Acolytes, to the archives. We've been expecting you. Dooku is the one Jedi turned Sith whose story and outlook are not the most straightforward. Even the timeline of exactly when he fell to the dark side and became a Sith is convoluted and full of contradiction, but the whys are relatively well known. Dooku judged the corruption of the Senate, who flitted away Jedi lives on missions that furthered their own agenda. They sent Jedi into losing situations, or let Jedi die on missions that didn't even require intervention. Dooku's frustration was compounded by how obtuse the Council was towards the Senate, and how they continued to placate politicians instead of acting in the best interest of the wider galaxy. All of that anger climaxed with the death of Qui-Gon Jinn. In recent years within our own community, Dooku has become something of an admired figure, one whose turn to the dark side is seen largely as justified despite the depraved things that he does. Some even go as far as to think of him as a tragic and a misunderstood hero. However, Luke Skywalker would not be so generous in his assessment of Dooku. So today, we open another holocron and talk about how Luke's teachings on the dark side proved that he believed Dooku was pure evil. Luke Skywalker knew of Dooku from first learning about him in the journals of Obi-Wan Kenobi, which were gifted to him on Tatooine. He was well aware of Dooku's past as a Jedi, and the fact that he had trained the master of Obi-Wan, along with all of the horrific actions that he would commit during the Clone War. When Luke's Jedi Academy was founded, their historians would look further into the story of Tyranus to gain a clearer picture of the man, but the more they found, the less they understood about Dooku. Jedi historian Tione Solsar would mention that Dooku was something of a complete enigma to Luke's new Jedi Order. He turned to the dark side whenever he was middle-aged. Nothing in his past suggested that he craved power. Dooku was a well-respected Jedi Master with a family fortune. And speaking of fortune, Tione would say that if he did crave power early on, Dooku was very quiet about it, as hardly any Jedi actually knew how wealthy Dooku was, and didn't discover this until after he became a count and left the Jedi. All that Luke's Jedi could understand about Dooku was that he suddenly started caring a lot more about Jedi lives at some point. This care for his brethren led him to becoming one of the more politically involved Jedi, and from there, it was a downward spiral into resentment of both the Jedi and the Republic that Dooku served. While Solasar would note that they had no idea whether Dooku joined the dark side before or after he left the Jedi Order, they would all agree that his transformation into a Sith Lord was one that was complete. What Luke has to say alludes directly to the story of Dooku. Later on, Luke would make a recording in a holocron talking about his experience with the dark side. He would talk about when he encountered it when facing Vader on Bespin, and later how he would surrender to the dark side when becoming Palpatine's apprentice in the Dark Empire Crisis. Luke had chosen to join the dark side for many reasons, but the chief of which was that he desperately desired to know why his father had done the same. But once he was brought back to the light by Leia and his friends, he would always remember how terrible the experience was. But because of this, Luke gained a personal knowledge of the dark side, one that gave him more insight into how the Sith think. When he was telling the story, Luke would go on to talk about how seductive the dark side really was, and how no matter how pure your intentions were, it is always a danger. Luke said this: just as those who are not predisposed to dishonesty might fleetingly consider the thoughts of thieves, the noblest of Force users are vulnerable to the dark side. You may not think yourself especially curious, easily angered, or envious, but the dark side is a strong seducer. It is a power that draws off of subconscious fears, plays off innocent desires, and feeds off selfish thoughts to transform one into a living nightmare. These words by Luke is not only a wise lesson, but is also a shot at Dooku. What Luke is essentially trying to explain when it comes to the dark side is, the means by which you justify in the end will never matter. Whatever intention someone has for deciding to use this power, no matter how noble, justified, honest, or self-sacrificial, they will always be twisted and corrupted by the darkness until that someone becomes the exact same thing they were fighting against. Anakin joined the dark side to save his wife from a death that he believed was certain, and only to have the prophecy of a self-fulfilling one when he became the cause of her death. Dooku desired to save Jedi lives and make the galaxy a better place by saving it from the corrupt political system. And so what did Dooku do? Ultimately, he was responsible for the deaths of countless Jedi while becoming the very heart of political corruption himself in the form of manipulating the greedy Separatist leaders. This is the living nightmare that Luke spoke of. Your means for using the dark side become absolutely meaningless when the path is taken. Dooku was evil, and there's no getting around this according to Luke. When he was a Jedi, he thought like a Jedi and fought like one. In the most honest of senses, Dooku wanted to do his duty as a Jedi to make the galaxy a better place. But when he became a Sith, those morals were compromised for the greater goal. Suddenly, power was more attractive, and instead of balancing the Republic, Dooku wanted to rule it. At first, he was reluctant to kill Jedi, and did anything he could to avoid actually killing Jedi by his own direct lightsaber. But at the time at the end of the war, he began to loosen his definition of what it meant to kill a Jedi, and by the end, he personally slew Master Tipley and took great pleasure in it, a terrifying contrast from the Dooku that started the war. In these archives, we have often talked about how much we like Dooku, how skilled of a fighter he was, and how compelling of a character he's been shown to be. However, many seem to think that Dooku is a secret hero, a misunderstood genius who did the right thing by joining the Sith. There have even been some who believe that he was actually playing the long game by joining the Sith, and he could turn against Sidious and kill him for the good of the Republic. But know that while Dooku did want to kill Sidious, his reasons were anything but charitable. He is a misunderstood person, but he is not a misguided hero. Whatever man Dooku may have been when he was a Jedi is gone, consumed by the darkness. Dooku became a monster who was willing to kill and torture his own friends in order to further his goal. He was even responsible for the death of his childhood friend Sifo Dyas, the only friend who truly stuck by Dooku's side when no one would. And he actually was proud of that kill, taking pleasure in it. Giving Sifo's lightsaber to General Grievous, Dooku may not have shown to have any classic Sith eyes, but this is a man enveloped in evil. And giving away this lightsaber, the lightsaber of his dearest friend, to a cybernetic monstrosity who would then use that lightsaber to butcher more of his friends, is the start of a very evil journey. One's potency in the dark side is represented by their Sith yellow eyes. This does not indicate their state of morality. This is why they are specifically Sith eyes, and not just the eyes of a dark side wielder. Dooku was enveloped by the dark side, and it changed him for the worse. But those are the writings that Luke would later have on Dooku, calling him pure evil. But what Grievous was a brutal, and in many circles, an underrated warrior and lightsaber duelist. Upon meeting General Grievous, Dooku noted that his pure aggression essentially made him ferocity incarnate. With Dooku noted that it was this aggression that would allow Grievous to triumph against any Jedi, given his cybernetic enhancements. Well, most Jedi. Dooku meticulously trained Grievous in the methodology of fear. As if a Jedi was afraid, it disrupts their literal connection to the Force, makes them weaker, vulnerable, and predictable. This was all before Dooku hands-on trained General Grievous. In their sparring sessions, Dooku realized something terrifying. Grievous's potential was very strong, but that he constantly got in his own way. Still though, Dooku wanted to ensure that he would always have the upper hand against the droid general, and remained composed, smashing aside the droid general's attacks every second that he got, and slipping his guard. However, as their training progressed, Dooku could sense the gap between their skill level narrowing. This gave Dooku reason for pause, and forced Dooku to leave some maneuvers and tricks up his sleeve, just like the ancient Sith did with their apprentices during dueling, ensuring that Grievous could never overcome Dooku simply because Dooku knew too much. Grievous could go against Jedi Masters in single combat, and more than that, he could win. Oftentimes, Grievous stacked every advantage in his favor, using Magna Guards and other droids when he encountered the Jedi. Fear was his greatest weapon. He would remain in the shadows, disrupt their very connection to the Force. He would become something greater, their worst nightmare, a true monster. With all of that said, Dooku was very pleased with General Grievous, especially since behind the scenes he had secretly manipulated his brain. In fact, one of the only promises that Grievous made Dooku make was that he would not tamper with his brain if he was going to undergo the cybernetic transformation. However, once the general was under, Dooku double-crossed him and had the rage receptors in Grievous's mind dialed up to 11, as well as made him more agreeable to the way and plan of the Sith. He had broken the trust of General Grievous, and he had created something truly special and equally disturbed. But with all of that said, he did not deem General Grievous infallible. Dooku warned the droid general that the more and more Jedi he killed, the more confident that he became. However, Dooku would state that there were Jedi left in the Order that Grievous would stand little to no chance against, as Dooku went on to name them from some of the most powerful to a few names that shocked the droid general and that he ultimately would disagree with until much later. One name that especially made Grievous angry that Dooku believed that he could not overcome in combat was the negotiator, Obi-Wan Kenobi. The other names that Dooku tossed around didn't mean very much to Grievous, as he knew of the skill and power of individuals such as Mace Windu and Yoda, but Grievous had fought Obi-Wan Kenobi multiple times over the Clone Wars, and Grievous was beginning to believe that his eventual defeat of Kenobi was an eventuality, a certainty. Dooku, though, heavily disagreed, and would actively predict how their duel would happen in Revenge of the Sith, a duel that occurred after Dooku himself had passed on. Dooku believed that Grievous lacked a few integral parts of lightsaber combat that would never allow him to reach the level of a true master. One was their ability to touch the Force. Mace Windu and Yoda's ability to touch the Force managed to bolster their lightsaber skills to unprecedented levels, but the other was discipline and skill in combat, as well as intelligence. Dooku realized that Grievous's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. If he came against an enemy that was completely composed, very familiar with the intimate sequences of all 7 forms of lightsaber combat, Grievous would not be able to overwhelm individuals such as Windu and Yoda, and would take away all fear, taking away Grievous's advantage, and leaving his key weaknesses, mainly his defense, wide in the open. If they could simply hold back the aggressive onslaughts of Grievous and wait for the precise moment, the duel would end in a Jedi's victory. Grievous could come to respect individuals such as Mace Windu and Yoda. In fact, in Labyrinth of Evil, he would even run from them. But Obi-Wan Kenobi was something different. which is why it's so fascinating that it was Kenobi that would ultimately defeat him. And Dooku's prediction was 100% accurate. So what about Obi-Wan specifically would lead him to defeat Grievous? According to Dooku, Obi-Wan Kenobi had less weaknesses than the other Jedi, although his strengths may not meet the bounds of someone like Mace Windu's Vapad, or the sheer ferocity of Yoda's Ataru. His mastery of the all-defensive form of lightsaber combat left very little holes in his dueling prowess. Essentially what this means is that Grievous's expertise is to exploiting the weaknesses of his enemies, specifically the Jedi, make them lose their composure, and cut them down because he's faster, more physically gifted. He preys on their very weakness in their forms. But Obi-Wan Kenobi has very little to exploit. This is why the Jedi Council would ultimately elect Obi-Wan Kenobi to be the one to hunt down and kill General Grievous, despite both Mace Windu and Yoda being active. They chose Obi-Wan. It was the simplicity of Obi-Wan Kenobi that counteracted the complexity of Grievous. As the war went on, Dooku's opinion on Grievous would ultimately evolve as well, as he would state that the general's greatest strength was his greatest weakness, his over-reliance on ferocity, and that to put things plainly, this ferocity would not equal to the skill of someone on the level like Obi-Wan, Yoda, or Mace Windu. Grievous was simply not powerful enough to reach those levels. He had a firm understanding of all 7 forms of lightsaber combat. They had all been downloaded into his mind, but putting them into action against someone else with the gifts of the Force that knew the lightsaber forms just as well, if not better than Grievous, and had experienced them in practice, was something else entirely. Dooku could see that Grievous was able to defeat his enemies essentially using algorithms and memorizing the sequences of lightsaber combat, lacking all the deeper intricacies of what it means to duel someone. In Dooku's own words in Labyrinth of Evil, he would call this finesse, and highlight Grievous's inability to understand the deeper levels of a duel beyond the physical. And because of this made General Grievous woefully predictable. In their final training session, Dooku admitted that he had made Grievous this way, and that he had not trained him properly. He had embraced Grievous as a brutal monster, and encouraged him to fight with rage, fear, terror, causing this to become the obsession of the droid general. It was Dooku's own fault that he left him ill-prepared to face an individual like Obi-Wan Kenobi, someone completely composed, a wall of stone. In the end, he was proven absolutely correct. Obi-Wan Kenobi, as described in the novelization for Revenge of the Sith, is able to fall masterfully within the Force itself. He consciously is no longer actively making any movements. He's at peace entirely, and relying entirely on the light side of the Force to guide his blade against the droid general, taking away the thing that the droid general needed in order to defeat any Jedi, let alone a master of defense in Obi-Wan Kenobi, and that was to disrupt one's connection to the Force. But Obi-Wan was not afraid of General Grievous, and Dooku knew this. So despite being superior in blade-to-blade skill alone, Obi-Wan Kenobi was now Grievous's trump card, and Dooku had recognized what the rest of the Jedi Council did as well, that it was Obi-Wan Kenobi that was best suited by far to take out General Grievous. And as Dooku predicted, it would not be a very hard duel for Obi-Wan to win at all. Obi-Wan Kenobi was the victor, and anyone who was a true master at lightsaber combat, the top minds concerning the lightsaber in the entire galaxy, every single one of them knew that Grievous stood no chance. But anyway, my friend, lasted 3 years. The Clone Wars was one of the most traumatic times in galactic history. There was no rest for any of the factions, as there was always something occurring. Within the small time frame of the war, so many evil machinations and experiments by Dooku would rise and fall. But one of the most mysterious creations of Tyrannis was his duo of the personal doppelgangers. This is one of the more secretive experiments that went on during the Clone Wars, and Dooku's attempt to somewhat clone himself using the dark side and secret experiments. Clones that could use the Force and mimic his own fighting style. Both of these body doubles would be defeated by Anakin Skywalker very early in the war, and you might notice that we said something like clones, as we're not just referring to them as clones outright. That's because there's a lot more to these doppelgangers than meets the eye, and our sources suggest that they weren't clones at all, but something far stranger. So today, let's open a holocron and dive into the mystery of the double Dookus. Our source today comes from Legends, Star Wars: The New Droid Army, which takes place very shortly after the Battle of Geonosis. A Padawan Skywalker is called by the Jedi Council to investigate the disappearance of one of their Republic informants, one who alerted them to a dangerous new type of battle droid being developed by the Separatist movement. In partnership with the Techno Union, the Separatists had been developing prototypes of a CB-3 Cortosis battle droid, and as the name suggested, the droid was essentially the make of a B-2 super battle droid, but with the shell of Cortosis instead of regular alloy. For those who do not know, Cortosis is a lightsaber-resistant metal. Any lightsaber blades that make contact with Cortosis will not only be repelled, but short out for a short period of time. Obviously, this makes them a complete anti-Jedi droid, as they wouldn't be able to defend themselves against such battle droids at all. Anakin finds all of this out during his investigation, as Skywalker is led towards the planet of Metolern, where the Techno Union factory is developing these anti-Jedi droids. Yoda and Mace Windu urge Skywalker to immediately infiltrate the factory and destroy it from within, not wanting to let these CB-3 droids ever hit the battlefield. During his journey, Dooku throws several of his dark acolytes at Anakin, but Anakin destroys them all. In the end, there was only one person left to stand between Skywalker and the destruction of the droid factory. This is where the first doppelganger of Dooku comes in. Anakin believes the entire time that it was the true Dooku that he was fighting, but in fact, it was simply a body double. This doppelganger was more or less used as a bodyguard for Wat Tambor, and was ordered to protect the CB-3 factory. It proved to be a worthy opponent for Skywalker though, as it could mimic Dooku's Makashi style, and could even use Sith lightning. However, it was clearly not the real Dooku, and the doppelganger was, in actuality, only about half the strength of the original. Still impressive though. But what Anakin noted is that the doppelganger had no deeper understanding of the dark side, and was defenseless against Anakin's rage-filled power strikes for Dooku taking his arm. It would be destroyed by Anakin, and would vanish upon its death. Sometime later, Skywalker would discover another one of these doppelgangers on Dooku's homeworld of Sereno, and destroyed that one as well. In functionality, it didn't seem as though the doppelgangers were really meant for full-on battle with the Jedi, as a Padawan Anakin took out both of them with relative ease. It seems that they were supposed to more function like puppet figureheads, or placeholders for the real Dooku. Tyranus had Sith business to attend to, interplanetary diplomacy, and the entire Separatist army to command. With all of that, he was always training new darkside acolytes, searching for artifacts, and creating more plans against the Jedi war effort. He can't always be around to govern the people of Sereno, or to oversee the production of a mysterious battle droid, so needing to be in multiple places at once, the natural course of action was to get a few bodies cloned. As we've seen in the galaxy, decoys were a commonality among royalty and the elite, and this was to protect them against assassination. But with Dooku, his decoys would need to not only be force sensitive, but competent enough with the lightsaber to mimic his own strength. So what exactly were these mysterious doppelganger clones? Why were they so successful, since cloning a force sensitive is notoriously difficult? The actual truth about this though, is that no one really ever found out. All we have are mere suggestions. The big thing that's tripping everyone up is that they weren't exactly clones. Both the developers of this game and the Star Wars fact files indicate that it's uncertain and highly improbable that a cloning process was used to create the doppelgangers. Not only is it out of Dooku's own character to allow himself to be cloned, but the doppelgangers don't exhibit clone traits. They don't seem to really have a mind of their own, despite operating independently from Dooku. Shockingly, the clones aren't even aware that they are doubles, or even have any sentience to speak of. Each of them talk and act as if they are the real Darth Tyrannis. All of his arrogance and grandiosity. We searched the pages of legends and both canon lore, and we have come to the conclusion exactly what these doppelgangers are. We believe that these were force-sensitive changelings, but the problem again lies in the fact that they are able to mimic Dooku's personality, even down to the last detail, even at the moment of their death. And then there's the fact that the doppelgangers tend to vanish when they died. Despite the fact that File offers as a suggestion, it's impossible for them to be force illusions, because we know that this requires an active, conscious effort to project them. And Dooku would have to be in the same place to project his consciousness. Even if Dooku were powerful enough to do this, he would have to be in strenuous meditation. Even with all of that aside, assuming perhaps the illusions are being projected by someone or something else, they're solid and have the ability to fight and wield the Force effectively. The doppelgangers can take lightsaber wounds and inflict them as well, so it's literally impossible for them to be illusions. The more you think about it, the creepier it gets, as each and every possibility starts getting ticked off the list. The only thing that we can think of is the last option that's offered, a dark side creation using alchemy. Here at the channel, we know that in the natural world of science, the Dooku doppelgangers just don't make any sense in the lore, but the dark side of the Force contains many possibilities that are unnatural. Only a ritual by Darth Sidious using the help of the Count, and probably a bunch of Sith alchemy, would produce creatures so strange as these doppelgangers. They have no sentience because they are literally meant to embody Dooku. They are subservient to him and have no ability to actually fight against him. They are only half of who he truly is. Each of them are puppets of Dooku's will, even extensions of his consciousness. Sidious was known to have researched the pages of Darth Plagueis' notes and had many dark side scientists on standby, creating hideous mutants using alchemy. We believe that these doppelgangers were another horrendous thing to come out of Palpatine's laboratories thanks to Plagueis. Whether from a cauldron or a test tube, it's now undoubtedly clear that Sith magic was involved in the creation of these Dooku doubles. This would explain their ability to use the Force and why they disappeared when they die. But of course, the price of that is that they are fragile. One can't simply make an army of these things because they're too weak to last long term. From what we can tell, this project didn't seem like something Dooku was even trying to keep around long term, but was just a temporary convenience to start the war off. But anyway, my friends, this is some deep lore that we covered today, and I hope you enjoyed it. But just because we couldn't find anything concrete in the lore doesn't mean that you can't. So what do you believe these Dooku doppelgangers were? The doppelgangers were described as a strange addition to a Game Boy Advance Star Wars game, which was meant to give the player a feeling of accomplishment for defeating Dooku. But the creators of the game explained that they couldn't have any continuity errors of Dooku being killed prior to Revenge of the Sith, especially by an Anakin who was just a Padawan. This is why they made the bosses half the power of Dooku. But what's interesting is that the game developer, Abel G. Penna, decided to have the doppelgangers be explained as products of the Force rather than clones, as he believed the clones were becoming an overused trope for inconsistent deaths. He also would go on to explain that the reason he had them disappear was to give more evidence that they were conjurings of the Force itself. The behind-the-scenes reasoning for the doppelgangers is actually pretty funny, but when you look at them from an in-lore perspective, and the fact that they are Sith creations makes them quite horrifying to think about. But as always,
Darth Tyranus is the undisputed master of the second form of lightsaber combat by the time of the Clone Wars, with a seemingly invincible win record. But despite Dooku's high opinion of his preferred lightsaber form, there was a moment when he was forced to admit its greatest flaw. A shocking moment. Greetings, curious acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. Makashi, also known as Form 2 lightsaber combat, or the Way of the Yassalamari, is the duelist form as many well know. It is perfectly designed for saber-on-saber combat, and when it comes to a single duel, there is simply no better form than Makashi. But as many also know, there are two distinct weaknesses to this form. Firstly, it is designed for a single opponent, and is weak when facing multiple enemies at once. Secondly, it is not optimized for blaster deflection. However, a true master of Makashi can make up for these weaknesses, as Dooku has done time and time again. We have seen Dooku be able to deflect blaster fire with the best of the saber wielders, and Dooku also knows how to isolate his opponents and take them out one by one if he is faced with several attackers. Just look at his duels with Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. However, there is one specific flaw in the Makashi style that Dooku was unable to compensate for, and in the end, it cost him his life. So today, my friends, we open up yet another holocron and analyze the thoughts of Dooku just mere moments before his death, so that we may analyze and discover the final fatal flaw of Makashi. The source we gather from today is the Revenge of the Sith novelization, where we get a view at the duel on the Invisible Hand through the eyes of Count Dooku firsthand. During this fight, Dooku had been tricked by Kenobi and Skywalker, who had actually fought with lightsaber forms that they were subpar at and were not their preferred styles, with Obi-Wan using a Taru and Anakin using Shien. They did this so that they would trick Dooku and lull him into a false sense of security and play on his arrogance, since they were the same forms that they had used against him on Geonosis, and forms that Dooku had subsequently dismantled with ease. This plan actually worked brilliantly, as Tyrannis was throwing them around easily and pretty much mocking them in his own mind. This wasn't until they suddenly changed to their true forms and fought so well that Dooku became terrified. We released a holocron recently talking about this scene where Obi-Wan had put real fear in Dooku for the first time, doing so by displaying his mastery of Form 3 Sarisu. But it was Anakin's use of Form 5 and its variant Gem So that actually forced Dooku into admitting the true weakness of his beloved Makashi. So now, let us read a few key lines from the novelization and analyze them in turn. Skywalker slammed his following strike down so hard that the shock of deflecting it buckled Dooku's elbows. The second strike bent Dooku's wrist. The third flash of blue forced Dooku's scarlet blade so far to the inside that his own lightsaber scorched his shoulder, and Dooku was forced to give ground. Skywalker came on, mechanically inexorable, impossibly powerful, a destroyer droid with a lightsaber. Each step a blow, and each blow a step. Dooku backed away as fast as he dared. Skywalker stayed right on top of him. He no longer tried to block Skywalker's strikes, but only to guide them slanting away. He could not meet Skywalker strength to strength. The boy was a Gem So stylist, and as fine of one as Dooku had ever seen. His own elegant Makashi simply did not generate the kinetic power to meet Gem So head to head. And there it is. Makashi has the ability to cut through almost any other lightsaber form. It is the direct counter to Shi-Cho and Ataru, and can very easily take care of others if the skill of the Form 2 user is good enough. And that is what Form 2 specializes in: skill, and skill alone. However, when it comes to the sheer power of Gem So, Makashi just doesn't have the kind of power to properly meet it head to head. You see, Makashi is much like fencing in that the users often move in a lateral way. The footwork of Makashi is usually front, back, and side to side, and they are often trained to walk along a cross pattern in order to properly lunge into an attack and then quickly retreat. They strike quick and fast like snakes, and can very elegantly maneuver around their opponent when need be. Aggressive and advancing strikes with Makashi rely on the pinpoint accurate blade work rather than physical might. As you see, the footwork and blade work complement each other in that way, and they are measured and balanced. However, with this in mind, it's now understandable how this kind of measured footwork doesn't exactly generate momentum. Let's analyze what Dooku said further. Each step a strike, and each strike a step. We can analyze how Anakin fights both in this duel as well as his duel with Kenobi on Mustafar. Skywalker is constantly moving forward. His blade motions and his footwork are completely lined up, but in a forward motion like a bulldozer. He doesn't stop moving forward, even when he's defending. The power of Gem So allows the user to invade their opponent's space and force them into a retreat. Makashi has its defensive capabilities for sure, but with its more measured and balanced footwork, it's unable to properly generate the necessary momentum to actually meet Form 5. And this is how Anakin prevailed. Sarisu, interestingly, actually does generate momentum in its own right, as the defensive maneuvers are something that Form 3 practitioners drill themselves on constantly. Many Sarisu sequences work off of the user orbiting their lightsaber to project a field of total defense, an impenetrable wall. Combine this with more circular footwork, and Form 3 is fully capable of keeping up with Gem So. They fit together like perfect puzzle pieces, and this is why Kenobi was able to outlast Skywalker. But Makashi doesn't have these sequences, as it prefers accuracy over power. Not to mention, this is Anakin we are talking about. The amount of physical strength he has is almost impossible for a human, and that is augmented by the Force, which we all know that Anakin has an ample supply of, and we soon get to see the effects that this has on Dooku as the fight wears on. Let us continue. The shining blue lightsaber whirled and spat, and every overhand chop crashed against Dooku's defense with the unstoppable power of a meteor strike. The Sith Lord spent lavishly of his reserve of the Force merely to meet these attacks without being cut in half. And Skywalker was actually getting stronger. Each parry cost Dooku more power than he'd used to throw Kenobi across the room. Each block aged him a decade. The passage would go on to say that Dooku was spending so much Force energy to simply defend against Skywalker that he was actually losing his perception of the room around him, and his senses were beginning to dull. This was the effect that Anakin's Gemso was having on the aged Sith Lord. It was in this single terrifying moment that Dooku realized that he was simply not the best duelist anymore, or at least that the styles no longer matched. This single fatal flaw in his lightsaber form was quickly sapping away his strength, and in a way that he had never dealt with before, and soon his energy would be drained so far that it left him open to having his hands dismembered. The duel was over. But
What
anyway,
is it
about Dooku's training that Darth Sidious found so terrifying? Greetings my friends and fellow acolytes, and welcome back to the channel. Count Dooku has had over 7 apprentices in his lifetime over the course of both Legends and Canon continuities. As a Sith Lord, he trained Asajj Ventress, Quinlan Vos, Savage Opress, and General Grievous, among a few other Dark acolytes. And as a Jedi Master, Dooku trained Rael Averross, Qui-Gon Jinn, and the subject of our holocron today, Kamori Vosa. Nearly every single one of Dooku's apprentices rubbed Palpatine the wrong way, and he deemed them all legitimate threats, enough for him to order the deaths of most of them. While Qui-Gon and Ventress would be the most infamous examples of this, we are actually going to be focused on Dooku's first Padawan, Kamori Vosa. In this holocron, we are going to talk about her life, who she was, and why Sidious not only insisted upon her death, but why he seems to hate all of Dooku's apprentices and deem them real, legitimate threats. One thing we can respect about Dooku's training was his adherence to the studies of the Force. In the same way, my friends, we invite you to expand your knowledge by subscribing to the channel and getting notified of all of our daily uploads. So now, let us begin. The story and history of Kamori Vosa is a strange one, and is very different from most Jedi that embrace a darker path. Kamori started her life as Dooku's first apprentice sometime around the year 42 BBY. In this time period, Sidious was still working with Plagueis, and Dooku was still a Jedi. The first time we ever see Kamori is in the flashbacks of Jango Fett, in the comic series known as Open Seasons. Here, she accompanies her master Dooku and a strike team of Jedi to put down the true Mandalorians, the Mandalorians who were framed for crimes by Death Watch on the planet of Galadran. For those familiar with this story, this was more or less Jango's origin, and how the famous warrior became a wandering bounty hunter, as well as where his hatred for the Jedi started. Long story short, since the true Mandalorians had been framed for massacres that they did not commit, they refused to submit to the Jedi. Kamori herself ended up having a loudmouth during the conversation, and got the Jedi in trouble. This resulted in her instigating a fight with the Mandalorians. The Jedi strike team would use brutal methods to suppress the battle, as the Jedi lost control of the conflict very quickly. The strike team even used illegal lightsaber techniques to hack one of Jango's brothers in half right in front of him. Jango would temporarily lose himself and savagely attack the group of Jedi, killing 6 of them with his bare hands, before eventually surrendering once he realized that he was all alone, the last surviving Mandalorian. The Jedi had killed all of the true Mandalorians, his family, right in front of him. From this story, and several others, we aren't surprised to find Kamori being described as headstrong and aggressive, with a certain spirit for battle that the Jedi often warned against. Despite these things, however, Dooku was greatly pleased with Kamori, and found her impressive in battle, even commending her on Galadran, as she had single-handedly taken down many of the highly trained Mandalorians personally, and showed that she was more powerful than the rest of the team. She was extremely talented with the blade, and possessed a great deal of promise in the Force as well. Like Dooku, she was a star pupil. Kamori was very powerful, and would have made a great Jedi if not for her attitude. Being headstrong and aggressive was already alarming, but something that not even Dooku could avoid and was concerned about was her obsession with her master. Kamori Vosa was absolutely obsessed with Dooku, and worshipped the ground that he walked upon. She was specifically, though, fascinated with Dooku's mastery of the lightsaber, aspiring to be just as powerful as he had grown. Kamori's lightsaber even sported a curved hilt design just as Dooku's did. The council became quite worried when this obsession and infatuation grew to an even greater degree, and both Dooku and the council were aware of these hidden feelings within Kamori. Soon, they deemed her unfit to become a Jedi because of this fascination, and Dooku would forbid her from taking the Jedi trials. This left Kamori Vosa to feel insulted and betrayed, resulting in her rushing off in the galaxy in an attempt to prove herself worthy to Dooku. To prove herself, Kamori vowed to take down the cult known as the Bando Gora. Unfortunately, this mission ended in catastrophe, and all of the Jedi, except for Kamori Vosa, were killed, and she was captured. Many months was the young Jedi tortured and held prisoner by the cult, to the point where she was driven to madness over all that had happened to her, specifically her denial of the Jedi trials. And of course, the dark side was waiting for Kamori with open arms, embracing it. Feeling it was the only thing that cared for her, Kamori Vosa would kill her captors and break free of her chains. Only, she decided not to flee. Instead, the now dark side drunk Kamori Vosa took the leadership of the Bando Gora for herself, and would go on to build a criminal enterprise in the Outer Rim, gaining followers by putting mind control substances into death sticks. After making deals with the Hutt Cartel, the Dugs, and several other dangerous groups, Kamori would unknowingly make herself a nuisance to the one person who anyone with power should never seek to bother: Lord Sidious. Kamori's exploits had run counter to Palpatine's plans, garnering her attention from the Dark Lord. Sidious saw how powerful and well-trained Kamori was, and he found himself concerned that she might be a problem, especially for his future plans. It just so happened though, that this was around the time that Dooku had freshly joined the Sith. Naturally, Sidious ordered his new apprentice to get rid of Vosa, which troubled Dooku a great deal. He was still new to the dark side, and was very reluctant to kill his former Padawan, who he admittedly cared about, especially after having lost Qui-Gon Jinn. Kamori Vosa was one of the true tests to Dooku's loyalty. Pushing past this though, Dooku decided to hold a contest among mercenaries, hiring Jango Fett to capture the Dark Jedi. Those familiar with the game Star Wars Bounty Hunters will know this next part, since this is the main plot of the story. After hunting, chasing, and fighting, Jango would find his way through Bando Gora in order to find Kamori, and the two would have a final showdown. Jango held his own quite well considering the power of the Dark Jedi, though of course it required full use of his entire arsenal to capture her. Kamori would give him the fight of his life. She was trained by Dooku, and fascinated with the dark side almost as much as her former master. Jango though pulled off the impossible and defeated her. However, he decided to spare her life. What Jango did not know was that Dooku had been shadowing him the entire time, and when the bounty hunter spared Kamori, Tyrannis would force choke the Dark Jedi from the shadows. Too weak to fight back at this point, Dooku's apprentice was helpless to stop her imminent death. And then, the first apprentice of Dooku was no more by the Count's own hand. Shockingly, for a moment, Dooku felt remorse and regret. He cared for Kamori Vosa as a person, but also thought that her talents were tragically wasted. Dooku would even comment that she was potentially the most gifted of all of his apprentices. The reason we wanted to highlight this overlooked character is to note the fact that seemingly every one of Dooku's apprentices turn out to be dangerous, especially to Palpatine. They all either grow too powerful or too problematic for Sidious to just let them go, rising far beyond somebody like an Inquisitor, for example. Qui-Gon was involved with the destiny of Anakin, so he had to be killed. Kamori made herself a problem due to her incredible power and reach within the criminal underworld. Ventress was becoming too powerful in general, and it made Sidious nervous that Dooku was planning to take over. Savage's death at Sidious's hand was more of a byproduct of his duel with Maul. But of course, Sidious still wanted to take care of the Zabrak, as he was one of the reasons Maul regained prominence. Though of course Sidious didn't really seem to pay much mind to the other three. We don't have any sources to suggest that Sidious ever took notice of Rael Averross or Voss. Quinlan though did become a Jedi again before he became too much of a problem. Grievous was essentially the only student of Dooku that Sidious was completely pleased by, but Grievous was more of a dog to be sicked on the enemies of the Sith. The point is though, Palpatine not only acknowledges the power of each of Dooku's students, but he is actively threatened by it. This being one of the greatest compliments to Dooku's own methods. There is something about Dooku's training that breeds strong and volatile warriors. They were all free thinkers, dangerously cunning, and were extremely hard to kill. This all goes to Dooku's training. Even as a Jedi, Dooku was incredibly stern and tough. His motif was to expect nothing less than perfection, with heavy consequences if met with failure. Both Qui-Gon and Rael recall how difficult life was training under Dooku, but they were both thankful for it in the end. The no-nonsense training breeds resourcefulness and resilience. power. Dooku impressed these kinds of perfectionism on his apprentices. It made each of them expect nothing less out of themselves but the absolute best. While his training was harsh, and sometimes even cruel, Dooku was consistently able to produce powerful wielders of the Force, thus giving Sidious pause for concern. But anyway, Count Dooku say that it was a treat to train General Grievous, and called him one of the most talented duelists that he had ever seen. Both Dooku and General Grievous were considered to be the two most terrifying men in the galaxy at the time of the Clone War. One a Jedi Master turned Sith, and the other a mechanical monstrosity responsible for the deaths of many Jedi. Though unlike most master and apprentice dynamics, it would be incorrect to say that Dooku and Grievous's relationship was a pleasant one. Dooku despised Grievous and thought of him as a monster. Of course, Count Dooku was known to hate any being that was half flesh and half machine, which was another reason for him to dislike Anakin. Despite his disgust towards the droid general, however, we learn in the Legends novel Labyrinth of Evil that Dooku actually enjoyed training Grievous a great deal. That is not to say that their training didn't have roadblocks, or that Dooku was not repulsed by Grievous, but there was something about the droid general that Dooku did find enjoyable. And in this video, we're going to analyze Dooku's feelings towards his most dangerous apprentice, and talk about how Grievous ultimately made Dooku feel about himself and his turn to the dark side. But before we begin, the Force calls us all, and on this channel, you can learn more to hone your skill through our daily uploads. So if you haven't subscribed already, be sure to Force crush that subscribe button and increase your knowledge with us daily. Now, let us begin. The idea that Dooku actually enjoyed anything about Grievous whatsoever is definitely a shocking sentiment, as it goes against about everything we know of their relationship. But the information that we get from Dooku makes this whole situation a bit more layered. Let's read from the passage from Labyrinth of Evil. Grievous had been a delight to train as well. No need to coax him to release his anger and rage, as Dooku had been forced to do during the training of his so-called Dark Jedi disciples. The Geonosians had arranged for Grievous to be nothing but anger and rage, and as to the general's combat skills, few if any Jedi would be capable of ever defeating him. There had been moments during their extensive combat sessions when even Dooku had been hard-pressed to outduel the cyborg. Dooku begins by saying that it was a delight to train Grievous, mainly compared to the Dark Jedi students that Dooku had trained before. In Legends, there had been a few Dark Jedi that Dooku threw at Anakin and Obi-Wan every now and then. Of course, most notably Ventress and Savage, as well as Quinlan Vos. In his training with all of them, there was little to suggest that Dooku ever really enjoyed himself while teaching. Quinlan, being a former Jedi, put roadblocks in their training, as it was difficult for Dooku to coax out the darker aspects of the Jedi Master. He found training Ventress easier, but we know from the Clone Wars that Dooku had the most trouble with Savage. Overall, ever since Qui-Gon, Dooku had never again had an apprentice that really pleased him, so of course, he probably found it to be a relief when he could find a student that he was able to more easily grasp, one that understood the concepts of rage. And of course, Grievous had plenty of that. His sheer aggression and tenacity in combat alone is one of the many reasons he was so successful against Jedi. But Dooku didn't just teach Grievous aggression, but also restraint. This was because the glaring flaw with this whole situation is that Grievous had no ability to touch the Force. One might think that rage and anger would be no use of someone who could not wield the dark side. However, it was very good for Grievous, who could use these feelings to fuel his cybernetic onslaught, as well as harbor hatred for his enemies. Because Grievous could not touch the Force, Dooku would provide him with many resources and tips. One of the most fascinating lessons to the droid general was when he laid out the criteria needed for Grievous to engage a Jedi. This included fear, surprise, and intimidation. Dooku explicitly said that if any one of those elements were lacking, it would be best for Grievous to retreat. In this quote though, we learned something very important about Grievous. He was never this aggressive to begin with. The origins of Grievous are somewhat shrouded in mystery. We know that he was once a proud warrior of the Kaleesh people, and that his people were neglected by the Jedi when they needed them most. Grievous has a distinct hatred for the Jedi, but was unable to overcome them with his regular body, and therefore was thrust into becoming a cyborg, as it was Dooku who offered him this great prize and the ability to kill Jedi. We learn in the novel that one of Grievous's few requests for this alteration was to keep his mind completely intact in its original form. No tampering whatsoever. However, Dooku had ordered the Geonosians to alter the brain anyway, making Grievous nothing but rage and anger without him ever even knowing it. After countless hours of drills and training, Dooku admits that he himself is hard-pressed to overcome the droid general during drawn-out duels. And yet, despite all of these good things that Dooku has to say about Grievous, Dooku later has much more to criticize, especially when it comes with the lightsaber. In another chapter in the same book later on, Dooku is viewing Grievous as he duels a set of Magna Guards. Grievous is engaging the guards with 3 lightsabers activated. It's here where we get more insight into Dooku's feelings towards his apprentice's choice of using multiple lightsabers at once. Quote, "The only aspect of Grievous's technique that vexed Dooku was the general's penchant for using 4 blades. 2 was bad enough, even in the form they had been used by Darth Maul, or in Anakin Skywalker's sad attempt to employ the technique on Geonosis against Dooku. But to use 3? What was to become of elegance and gallantry if a duelist could not make do with a single blade? Well, what had become of elegance and gallantry in any case? It is not surprising to find that Dooku disagreed with using more than one lightsaber, with this being a sentiment that he would unknowingly pass on to Darth Vader through his dueling with Anakin. While Dooku enjoyed Grievous's anger and his tenacity, and he was indeed one of the most gifted of his students, even above Quinlan Vos, Ventress, or Savage, there was quite a bit to be desired when it came to Grievous's finesse, and Dooku despised this fact. Without the Force, it was impossible to wield a lightsaber effectively, or at least with supreme elegance, as Grievous in this respect proved Dooku wrong, wielding a lightsaber with tenacity and rage. In fact, Grievous's sheer brute strength made Dooku question his own form. Later in the same scene, Dooku is thinking over how powerful, quick, and agile Grievous truly was. He was a formidable sight to behold, and one that had felled many Jedi. Unfortunately, Dooku wasn't proud of this fact at all. In truth, he found it to be disheartening, especially towards his own views on Jedi combat and the lightsaber. Dooku would go on to ponder the place of finesse, and how even with Form 2 Makashi, Grievous was able to defeat Jedi. What shocked Dooku is over elegance, finesse, and knowledge of the blade. It was brute strength that won the day. He talked about it like this. Defeat often came at the hands of less experienced players who knew nothing about the traditional strategies. A professional fighter, a combat artist, could be defeated by a cantina brawler who knew nothing about form, but everything about ending a conflict quickly, without a thought to winning gracefully nor elegantly. Dooku's analogy proved that he was sorry that the Jedi were coming to an end, in part thanks to the monster that he had trained. Someone as brutish and strength-based as Grievous, the one cutting down Jedi who trained for years to hone the elegant skill of the lightsaber. Grievous was in fact an atrocity, and Dooku knew it. It was an atrocity of his own design. Wrapping up, Dooku was conflicted in his training of Grievous. He enjoyed the ease of rage that Grievous could tap into on a moment's notice, and how easily he took to combat. But Dooku was disgusted by Grievous's animalistic tendencies while wielding the graceful and beautiful weapon of the lightsaber. His tact had no elegance, and his form no finesse, and yet it worked. It was a slap in the face to everything that Dooku had trained for. What were Dooku's very harsh criticisms of Yoda as the Jedi Grand Master? The rivalry between Dooku and Yoda post Dooku's fall is legendary. It is the classic good master versus fallen apprentice story, but with much more complexity, especially when considering many of the points that Dooku raises against Yoda. He's right. From many observations, Dooku's turn to the dark side was justified based on the reasons that he gave, and while that in no way acquits him of any and all of the crimes that he would commit, it does help to display a glaring flaw in the Jedi Order that is embodied by Yoda. The Grand Master of the Jedi Order is seen as the wise old leader, always ready to train and aid young Jedi in need. For the most part, he is that person. Yoda is good. However, Dooku's very existence exposes Yoda's weaknesses, and even a little bit of Yoda's darker aspect. The Count of Sereno turned Darth Tyranus has quite a bit to say when concerning his former master, and hardly any of it is flattering. Today, we are going to take an in-depth look at Dooku's many scathing quotes about Yoda, because it's here that he actually goes into detail about what exactly he feels for Yoda, and why he feels Yoda is terrible for the galaxy, as Dooku puts it in the most understandable way possible. So today, my friends, let's take a look. This is a quote by Darth Tyranus to Darth Sidious during one of their many conversations, and it goes like this. The Jedi Order's problem is Yoda. No being can wield that kind of power for centuries without becoming complacent at best, or corrupt at worst. He has no idea that it's overtaken him. He no longer sees all the little cumulative evils that the Republic tolerates and fosters, from slavery to endless wars, and yet he never asks, why are we not acting to stop this? Live alongside corruption for too long, and you no longer notice the stench. The Jedi cannot help the slaves of Tatooine, but they can help the slave masters. There is a lot to unpack here from Dooku, but the very first thing that Dooku criticizes Yoda of is his age. When we think about Yoda's age, a lot of it is said to his advantage. He's wise, and he's seen almost everything. So much wisdom and power can be gained in that time, and spent building something great, which Yoda has done. Yoda decided to allocate all of the time of his near-immortal life devoted to the Jedi. Surely, that would mean that his wisdom would be invaluable to the state of the Jedi Order today. But Dooku, interestingly, refutes this and says that this is actually a curse and not something that works in Yoda's favor. He criticizes Yoda for not adapting to the times and allowing the Order to do the same. Someone with a long lifespan like Yoda should learn to stay up to date with an ever-altering galaxy. But according to Dooku, Yoda did not do this. Instead, he was stuck in the old ways of the Jedi Order. In the Revenge of the Sith novelization, Yoda would even admit that this was one of his fatal flaws, saying to the spirit of Qui-Gon Jinn that he did not alter the Jedi Order with the state of the galaxy, and therefore was caught off guard by the evolved Sith. He had failed because he had trained the future generation to be like the Jedi that had trained him. Yoda admitted that this was a mistake and that the Order's fall was his fault. Shocking that at the end of it all, Dooku and Yoda agreed despite standing on opposite sides of the spectrum. Yoda should not shoulder all of the burden, but it is true that he was at fault. And shockingly, Dooku was the first one to point this out. Yoda had tethered the Jedi to a republic that was full of greed and politicians, outright evil senators like Orn Free Taa, who sold out his entire homeworld of Ryloth and his people into slavery so that he could live a luxurious and comfortable life. There is of course no need to mention those senators playing both sides of the war and profiting off of it. Those on the Hutt's payroll. The kinds of laws and statutes being passed in the Senate were not for the good of the galaxy, it was for the good of the pockets of those in charge. The galaxy suffered, and the only quality of life changes were those in the upper class and the core worlds, leaving the mid and outer rims to fight for their literal scraps. What made this worse is that Yoda not only still believed the Republic was the best chance for democracy and peace, but he backed this up by effectively allowing the Jedi to become lapdogs of the Senate. The Jedi called themselves a shield, but yet acted as a sword for the Senate, getting involved in matters that they had no business in, and Jedi blood being spilled on behalf of senators. Rather than the Republic emissaries being sent to peacefully settle difficult political matters, it was the Jedi who were their ambassadors, and such as what we saw in the opening of The Phantom Menace, which should have never happened. The Trade Federation blocked Naboo. This was aggressive and a slight declaration of war. The Republic should have responded with senators or ambassadors. While we on the outside know that this entire thing was a ruse by Sidious, there was nothing yet to tip off anyone that this move has sinister motives at all. The Trade Federation was being greedy and suspicious, but there wasn't yet any call for Jedi intervention. No actual moves of invasion had been made, and the Viceroy was open to negotiation. In the opening scroll of The Phantom Menace, we learned that it's Palpatine who secretly dispatched Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon to see this matter out. And of course, as Sidious, he orders their termination in order to begin the conflict. But the Supreme Chancellor should have never had this power in the first place. He should have had no ability to dispatch the Jedi of his own accord. Had the Federation acted violently against the ambassadors, then a call for Jedi intervention would have been warranted. But this is a prime example of the Jedi being the lapdogs of the Senate and Sidious taking advantage. advantage. To make things worse, the Jedi didn't have any representative in the Senate at all, and were forced to obey their every whim. It was because of this that worlds like Dooku's home planet of Sereno were left to fend for themselves. There was a time when Sereno was threatened by a dangerous band of pirates that were harassing the world and its people. Dooku's very sister transmitted a message directly to the Jedi Order asking Dooku for help, and the Order turned his family away. Why? Because Sereno refused to join the Republic and wanted to remain independent. Because they were not a part of the government, the Guardians of Peace and Justice denied them any help at all. Disgusted by this, Dooku went rogue and flew to liberate Sereno himself, which he did in a matter of a single week. And it was on Sereno that Dooku would begin to make the choices that he did, and would ultimately lead him down to the path of the Sith, with the final straw being when Dooku announced to Yoda that if one more Jedi lost their life on account of the Republic, that he would leave the Jedi Order, and the very next Jedi who died would be his Padawan and friend in Qui-Gon Jinn. Dooku was enraged with Yoda, calling him complacent, accusing the Grand Master of being foolish and old. Dooku believed that he himself would be a far better Grand Master, and in the novelization for Revenge of the Sith, we have a flashback between Dooku and Sidious on the Invisible Hand. During this conversation, we learned that Sidious promised Dooku once that the Empire had achieved full glory, that Dooku was supposed to lead what was essentially going to be a new Dark Jedi Order, acting as the Empire's enforcers, and a new Jedi Order would be born of the doctrine of the Sith. While this seems hypocritical, we'll have to remember that by this time, Dooku was fully twisted by the dark side. In Dooku's mind, it was fine that his Jedi would be working for the government because his own master was the leader. Dooku trusted Sidious's judgment above all else, and he knew that if Dooku started a brand new Jedi Order led by the teachings of the Sith and the dark side, that Sidious would support them far better than Grandmaster Yoda or the Republic ever did. This was Dooku's dream, and this was Sidious's lie. In Dooku's mind, this new, reborn Jedi Order would surpass Yoda's order in both power and effectiveness, a force for real change. In the end, Dooku began his path caring more about the stability of the galaxy than anything else. But what's most interesting of this all is the first thing that we had noticed is that although Dooku calls Yoda's integrity into question, he gives his former master the benefit of the doubt and says that Yoda doesn't seem to even realize what he's become. There was always a part of Dooku that wished that Yoda would see the error of his ways, a part of Dooku that still always loved and respected Yoda, and proves that although you could take Dooku out of the Jedi, you could not take the Jedi out of Dooku. And perhaps had Yoda listened to the concerns of his old apprentice much sooner, I do believe that Dooku would have never turned, and perhaps Sidious would have been unearthed, the Jedi Order reborn anew, powerful and righteous. But anyway, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're here with another discussion video. Today, we wanted to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is lightsaber duels, specifically Dooku and Sidious, and how they both stacked up to Yoda, how the battle on Geonosis between Yoda and Dooku was really eye-opening for Palpatine, to the point where Palpatine even held a substantial fear for Dooku following this. It's a really famous topic, and we wanted to get into exactly why Dooku's performance against Yoda caused Palpatine to be filled with such fear for Dooku and just how powerful he had become. But also we wanted to get into what is Dooku's approach when fighting Yoda blade to blade versus Palpatine's approach fighting Yoda blade to blade, and why Dooku experiences a lot more success than Palpatine famously does. Again, just keep in mind, this is lightsaber to lightsaber. It's not taking into account Palpatine putting away his lightsaber to combat Yoda, which is a topic that we'll get into a little bit deeper into the video. But I'm joined yet again with the Archivist.
Hey guys, what's going on? I'm excited for this one.
Yeah, so we'll get to talk about what makes Yoda so proficient as a duelist, what makes him so deadly, and how Sidious's opinion of Yoda and then later Dooku transforms. And in Star Wars, a lot of times you really get a good idea of where someone's power level is when other characters are reacting to how they perform in certain situations. And Dooku and Yoda is the best example of that. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you real quick. What are Yoda's biggest strengths in a duel? What puts him above everybody else? What puts him, in the opinion of the people in the galaxy who are most familiar with him, maybe the best lightsaber duelist in the entire galaxy as of Revenge of the Sith, with the only real rivals maybe being Windu, Anakin, and Dooku and Sidious. So what makes Yoda the best, essentially?
Well, we kind of explored this a little bit when we were talking about the when Yoda was fighting General Grievous, why Grievous was completely unable to even get a mark on Yoda, much less even try to fight him on equal ground. Like, Yoda is the master of Ataru, and this is a form that's all about acrobatics, expending a lot of energy, but primarily using the Force to enhance your physicality. Now, we know with someone of Yoda's venerated age and his ability to command the Force, we forget, we talk a lot about how Yoda's really strong at physically applying the Force outside of himself, but we need to also remember that all the power we've seen him manifest externally, there's even more of that going on internally. And when you think about all the power that Yoda has boxed up in his little form, the amount of speed and acrobatic power that can come from that energy inside of him makes him probably one of the best users of the fourth form of lightsaber combat.
Yeah,
and
probably the best in all of the
Yeah,
lore.
Exactly.
Fairly.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I mean, because the thing about it is the way that Ataru works is it doesn't operate a lot like a lot of other lightsaber forms. I like to think about it something like this. It's like you think about how the footwork of lightsaber combat is sort of, you got your duelists on the floor, and they sort of operate on a 2D plane of movement. And that means their feet are kind of planted on the floor. They might use a few rolls and flips to kind of gain a height or leverage or something like that, or just to reposition. But Yoda's footwork is never just grounded to the floor. It's like his footwork is three-dimensional, because in like the Grievous comic, he is just climbing all over that cyborg, and just his vertical movement is the biggest factor here. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I mean, he displays that against Dooku and Palpatine as well, where he's able to bounce around the walls. And you wrote in the discussion notes here that he's able to essentially ride the Force like a wind, gaining momentum and leverage at will. He can jump up in the air and strike down against someone with an overhanded strike extremely powerfully without anything bouncing off of to like generate leverage and momentum. He can use the Force to do that because of his small stature, which brings so much weight to bear against every strike that Yoda is levying against somebody. And while he may not be able to generate the leverage that like an Anakin can, it's staggering for his form. It's staggering for his form, and he's able to change his direction so rapidly that 1 second he's attacking from above you to the next he's attacking to the side of you. He is almost as ferocious of a duelist in terms of like his offensive output as somebody like Maul or Palpatine. Like, he is on that level, despite being as reserved as he is normally in a duel. He is as offensive minded as someone like Maul or Palpatine would be, and that makes him really impossible to pin down.
Yeah, because I mean, it's like it's very unassuming. You go into it thinking, like Grievous did, that it was going to be easy to kind of get him down and to use one's height as leverage against him. And then he's got that surprising burst of speed, momentum, and verticality, kind of using the Force to just almost defy gravity to make his airtime last longer so that he can position himself in a way that most duelists just genuinely, physically can't.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that I think is very interesting about Yoda is the people that underestimate him are always like Jedi are non-force sensitives, but never Sith. Dooku and Sidious do not underestimate Yoda whatsoever. They know how good of a duelist he is. Anakin can say whatever he wants to about him being better than Yoda, but Dooku doesn't. Dooku probably thinks that he's better than Yoda, but I wouldn't say he underestimates him, and that's what makes him so impressive in the duel on Geonosis. But Palpatine absolutely does not underestimate Yoda whatsoever when others do. Let's go ahead and break down Dooku's approach against Yoda in Attack of the Clones and why this duel is so impactful and goes to illustrate Dooku's power and how he's grown to not only the Jedi, but to also Palpatine. You want to sort of talk why like that's so impressive?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly have always thought that the Geonosis duel was super underrated. Because I mean, it's the first time that we get to see Lord Tyranus show off his skill as one who has mastered the blade as a Jedi and as a Sith. And he gets to actually prove his mettle against the Grand Master of the Jedi Order.
Who at the time I would say is undisputedly the best duelist in the galaxy.
Oh, yeah, no, without a doubt. That was kind of like a well-known, almost textbook fact in the Jedi Order at that point. 'Cause, I mean, Yoda has held that title for about 800 years by that point, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to Dooku, so one thing that is a known fact is lightsaber forms do sort of follow a rock, paper, scissors type of effect, where there are some that are hard or soft counters to the others. And it just so happens that Makashi happens to be Ataru's hard counter. And which means that because of the elegant and clean movements of the blade, and it's able to counter the more wild and erratic nature of Ataru users. They're able to keep them grounded and predict the acrobatics much easier. So that's already factor number one. But of course, with Dooku mastering the form to its absolute perfection and having been trained by Yoda while, we assume practicing with him quite often, he knows the way that Yoda fights. He knows his ability to get inside of people's guard and even just jump all around them to confuse the opponent. Because Yoda moves with such speed and ferocity that it can confuse and bewilder even seasoned Force sensitives, as we've seen before. I mean, he even does it to Sidious, but of course, we'll talk to that in a minute.
It's Dooku's advantage to pin Yoda. And, as you also put with the notes, his lightsaber, the curved hilt, gives him more leverage. Makashi is all about being precise and making precise cuts and precise parries. And the entire duel is Dooku parrying Yoda until Yoda actually stops and the two of them have a little blade lock where Dooku has managed to successfully stifle a full-blown offensive attack by Yoda.
It's amazing how, like, looking at that fight, I watched it and even slowed it down a little bit, just kind of watching how Dooku moves with Yoda. He doesn't move too much, which for some you might think that that's giving the advantage to the Ataru user, but by sort of keeping himself centered and not being intimidated by Yoda's flurry of attacks, he manages to maneuver his body to where he constantly keeps Yoda in front of him too. That kind of goes hand in hand with the leverage idea, is with his curved hilt, with his elegant strokes, there also comes the fact of making sure that the broad side of his blade is always facing the Jedi Master, and that he is constantly keeping Dooku is keeping Yoda at his strongest point of contact, where the most strength in his blade is. Where the most strength, excuse me.
Yeah, it's really interesting, too, looking at the way Dooku fights Yaddle compared to the way Dooku fights Yoda. Yoda is obviously way more aggressive than Yaddle is, and when Dooku can control Yaddle's center line in that duel, the duel with Yoda is more so about controlling his own center line. You know what I'm saying? Being able to change advantage, to change direction against Yoda at a whim to hold the Grandmaster back. And whereas he knows he's better than Yaddle in Tales of the Jedi, she really stands no chance against him blade to blade whatsoever. He's able to control her direction. He's able to pin her down with his precision very effectively. Where in contrast to that, Dooku's focus when he's fighting Yoda is not being pinned down himself. That is his main goal, and you can clearly see that.
Yeah, it really is amazing when you watch them. I'm glad you brought that up because Yaddle, as we could see by her stances and by how she moved her blade, she was a Sarisu practitioner, probably not one as adept as Obi-Wan, because, I mean, you know, she's
Definitely
a consular.
not.
She's not... No, she's not going to be focusing on blade work. She was mostly known for her force abilities, at least in Legends continuity. But you know, you're exactly right when you say that Dooku, even as a Makashi user, which is considered to be more of a balanced form where you balance offense and defense, I mean, he had Yaddle on the back pedal during that entire fight. He was very aggressive. And you could see that he knew he had the advantage there. But with the fight with Yoda, he knew he was measuring his skill against his master's, so he remained mostly on the defensive just to see how well he could contend with Yoda.
And I think that even going on in the Clone Wars, this is also illustrated when he's fighting Anakin and Obi-Wan. He's able to... He's effective against them because fighting Yoda is essentially like fighting 4 Jedi at once. You know, where he's able to change direction so rapidly. He's able to attack from so many different avenues that fighting Yoda is essentially training against a machine. And then when you enter like an actual sport of some kind, everything is moving slower. That's who Yoda has pitted himself against his entire life that's who Dooku has pitted himself against is Yoda his entire life. And because of that, everything else on the battlefield when it comes to a duel has opened up to Dooku because he is almost as good as the best one ever. If not, at that point, you know, maybe equals. That's a debate.
Yeah, I mean, and you also got to see how Dooku masterfully uses his environment to his advantage. Sidious does this probably to a greater degree, but if you'll notice, he kind of keeps his back to his starship for most of the duel, trying to keep Yoda in a specific cone of his vision until Yoda actually manages to slip this and bounce on top of the starship, and then Dooku immediately strikes his position on the starship to get him back down.
Gotcha. I do remember that. So you wrote in the notes, Dooku is not attempting to beat Yoda here. Can you sort of explain why that is?
Well, I mean, we got to remember the exact circumstances of what was going on during the Battle of Geonosis. Dooku, he was not challenged by Obi-Wan and Anakin. He was merely delayed by them, and not by much time at that. He was actually trying to escape because, obviously, his position was compromised. Too many Jedi. He had the Death Star plans. He was not trying to sit there and actually kill anybody. He was just trying to get out. But Anakin and Obi-Wan, they stifled his escape, and then Yoda comes in. And for just a moment, Dooku's mind is still on his escape, but I like to think that he recognized that as a golden opportunity to actually prove how powerful he is, both to the Jedi and to himself. So he holds off on his escape for just a moment, just so he could see how good he could do against his old master. They start out with the sorcerer's battle using their force powers, and then they get into a blade to blade. And it's a very quick duel, but part of the way through that, as Dooku's kind of on the defensive and he's fighting Yoda, his mind's still on retreat because the Death Star plans are obviously way more important than trying to triumph over his master in this moment. And not to mention, we all know that he knows that clone troopers and other Jedi are probably close behind Yoda. Which is true. Moments away. I mean, the duel, it's in its entirety only lasted about a minute, maybe less than that. And immediately after Dooku gets out, Padme and the clones come in.
It's incredible how a man with all of the disadvantages, all the advantages going against him, has such control over the situation to the point where he delays his escape to prove to Yoda exactly how strong he has become. But this not only proves to Yoda exactly how strong Dooku has become, it proves to Palpatine how strong Dooku has become. He utterly shocks his master by his ability to stifle Yoda. In fact, I would say it appears as if Sidious is far more impressed by this than Yoda was. He is absolutely shocked that Dooku is able to stalemate the Grand Master of the Order, and that is because Sidious does not underestimate how powerful Yoda is. He can underestimate how powerful Anakin, or overestimate how powerful Anakin is, and underestimate Kenobi, but he never underestimates Yoda. Never. And that's why when their duel opens, he tries to run.
Yeah, it's really interesting because Sidious does recognize Yoda as one thing and one thing only, his rival. He understands that Yoda is his light side counterpart, and even to some degree respects him for his power. And I put respect in a loose sense, but I say that because Palpatine, as a Sith, he sticks to his morals, and those morals are power. He respects power in whatever form that comes in. I mean, we're about to start talking heavily about why Palpatine enjoyed Grievous so much, that even though he didn't have power in the Force, he had physical power and was able to prove his superiority over the Jedi despite his disadvantages. And so it's like, when he sees Yoda, he's like, this is my counterpart, this is my ultimate rival. So, heck yeah, he's not going to underestimate him. When he sees Yoda come in, he's immediately thinking, what advantages do I have? And, I mean, the hallway is literally right there, right across from him. So when he tries to run, he's trying to force Yoda right into that hallway.
And the reason for that is because Ataru has less advantages in a more confined space. It has less avenues for attack, less options to generate momentum, and Sidious can essentially pin him down, which, as we saw with Dooku, that is how you beat Yoda, is you have to pin him down. There's no other way. You have to cut off his avenues of attack, and you have to cut off his abilities to generate leverage. But obviously, Yoda knows that, and he cuts him off. And we learn from the novelization, it's not Sidious's intention to avoid a confrontation with Yoda, but it is his intention to stack as many advantages in his favor against Yoda, in large part because he saw how well, Dooku had done against Yoda, and that fear that he had of the Grand Master, of the Master of Ataru. And I think that if you took away all the hubris and Sidious and you asked him, who is superior blade to blade, you or Yoda, I think after Revenge of the Sith, Palpatine would probably be honest, and I think he would say Yoda. Obviously, he would follow that up with comments like, the lightsaber is a Jedi weapon. I have grown beyond such means. I merely use it to insult the Jedi. The lightsaber is as meaningless to me as a speck of dust. He would back it up with some super arrogant, drawn-out explanation. But I think he would start his explanation with, yes, Yoda is better blade to blade than I am if I take all hubris away. And he doesn't have to say that. He puts his lightsaber away against Yoda in that duel. He actively decides to put his lightsaber away. He's not disarmed.
Yes.
He's not disarmed. He puts it away. And that is because he knows he can't beat him.
He definitely tries, though.
He does try.
Sorry, what were you about to say?
I was just going to turn it over to you and ask you what key differences you see in the conflict between Dooku and Yoda versus Yoda and Sidious. And you're absolutely right. Sidious does try, and that's probably speaking to his hubris as well, and probably a little bit of frustration to if Dooku can do this, I should be able to do this, but he's ultimately proven wrong. But what are the key differences there between the two Sith Lords and how they fight the Grand Master?
Well, I like to think of it this way. In in the Dooku versus Yoda fight, even though, yes, Dooku is a Sith Lord at this point, but I mean, look at the way he fights. This is a Jedi versus Jedi conflict. Dooku, as a Sith, fights like a Jedi. He keeps his cool. He uses his internal rage, obviously, to fuel his power, but he fights calmly, and Luke talks about that later on, about how when he says he believes that Jedi will always beat Sith at the lightsaber because Jedi can keep their cool and they're not going to get swept up in like a storm of rage and lose their technique. Dooku is all technique, and he's all about keeping his cool while still using the dark side. It's really a beautiful sight to behold when you break it down in those metrics. But the thing about it is when Yoda is fighting Sidious, that is a Jedi versus Sith duel. And you see Sidious getting upset. He's actually using his anger. And one of the reasons that he gets upset is because he can't pin Yoda down. And the reason he's trying to do that is Dooku remained mostly on the defensive, as we said before, because that's something a Jedi would do. But Sidious actually, even though he's a master of the 7 forms of lightsaber combat, he primarily uses the 7th form Juyo, which is an aggressive form in and of itself. And he chooses to actually meet Yoda's aggression with his own, and goes on the offensive himself to force Yoda on the defensive. Ataru is very weak when it comes to defense. The form is almost all attack. It's very much like Jimso in that way. But it's interesting to watch that when he fails to put Yoda into the hallway, Sidious then chooses a different area where it's smaller, which is the Chancellor's podium. And he flips a switch, causes them to raise up, giving Yoda less area to move around. And despite that, the new Emperor still cannot pin Yoda down no matter how aggressive he gets. And if you notice, after his first snarl, like after the first close-up saber lock, Yoda actually puts him on the defensive and goes on an attack vector, and Sidious really doesn't like that.
He overpowers him
after that. Yeah,
you can see him you can see Yoda overpower Sidious.
I love it.
I think in that moment, all of Sidious's fears are realized. And I would also like to think that if Dooku was still around in some respect, say he's still at full power, I think Sidious would have thoughts about getting rid of Dooku as quickly as possible, because all of his fears would be confirmed. Another interesting thing about Dooku, real quick, because everyone will say, "Well, Anakin beat Dooku. Can Anakin beat Yoda here?" And it's not. Star Wars doesn't operate on ABC logic, not at all.
No, it doesn't.
It operates. You have to take them specifically in characters, how they fight and how that compares to one another. You have to take into account their environment. Their mindset is massively important. I don't think anyone would ever say that they think Obi-Wan's more powerful than Anakin, and yet that's the most famous duel maybe in the entire franchise. Definitely in the entire franchise. But Dooku in Revenge of the Sith, he's older, he's fatigued, he's tired against Anakin. And I think that the Dooku in Attack of the Clones, if he were to fight Anakin in Revenge of the Sith, I think it would be a lot closer. I'm not saying Anakin doesn't win still, but I'm saying it's a lot closer. Dooku in Attack of the Clones is probably at his prime.
Yeah, I guess you would say his prime in terms of blade skill balanced out with force ability and his physical ability. Because in, I think it said in the Revenge of the Sith novelization, Dooku was 87 in Revenge of the Sith?
Something close to that, yeah.
And it said that he was feeling every one of those years when fighting Anakin. And I love, there was a moment where Matthew Stover, he writes it beautifully. He's like, with every blow that Anakin rains upon Dooku, it ages him by another year and then another decade. And he's just depleting in his power and his physical strength the longer that the duel goes on because of how strong Anakin is now.
Yeah. Going back to the whole Sidious and Dooku thing, though, let's wrap it up. What are our sort of closing thoughts on Dooku and how he approaches the duel with Yoda, and Sidious and how he approaches it. What I think it is a realization of Dooku's power, and it's confirmation to Dooku himself that he is in fact almost as powerful and as skilled as Yoda at the blade, and that instantly makes him a major threat to Sidious, because for Sidious, he never believed this. He always thought that Dooku would be a very strong asset, but the confirmation that Dooku is now, on the threat level of somebody like Sidious instantly, or on somebody like Yoda, instantly puts Dooku on the top of like most dangerous people to Palpatine. And that's why later when Ventress starts growing in power and Ventress starts, becoming more and more adept with the lightsaber and with the Force, the two of them are a legitimate threat to Palpatine's rule. And I don't think that if that ever I don't think if Dooku ever fought Yoda on Geonosis, Palpatine would have had that fear and that respect. And the respect and the fear that he has for Yoda is translated directly to Dooku, because now he sees what Dooku can do.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's my pretty much closing argument, or not even an argument, closing statement. Palpatine's fears are proven correct. He's forced to put his lightsaber away against Yoda. He's more powerful than Yoda in the Force, but Yoda's ability to fight offensively and to fight intelligently are all confirmed in that moment. And along with that, all of Palpatine's prior fear for Dooku also confirmed in that moment.
I like the just the separation of the strengths between Yoda and Darth Sidious, because when it comes to Yoda and Dooku, this, like I said earlier, this is very much a personal conflict, where it is definitely the apprentice trying to prove his superiority over the master, and he does that in the way that he and Yoda have always connected before, which is the lightsaber. And of course, Dooku just fights his heart out because he wants to prove how powerful he is. With Sidious, this is actually about winning, and this is about putting down the Jedi once and for all. It's very idealistic. And so when he can't best Yoda at the lightsaber, he acknowledges, okay, well, it doesn't really matter anyway. This is not what this conflict is even about. Because, as you know, Sidious had already won at that point. Like, he had the Empire, the galaxy was his. This fight with Yoda was more like just a personal itch to scratch. But this wasn't the Old Republic anymore. They didn't have to settle things with the lightsaber. So Sidious falls back on his Force abilities, where he can actually prove he's the superior, and he keeps Yoda at a distance by throwing the Senate pods, and he's much happier doing this, as we can see. And as soon as Yoda even gets close, first thing that Sidious does is he uses a blast of Force lightning, probably stronger than we saw him do on Mace Windu. Like, if you look at the footage, Palpatine kind of keels back from his own Force lightning and blows Yoda's lightsaber right out of his hand, first thing. And then they kind of go into their Force clash. And he just gets rid of that immediately.
I look at it as just Palpatine being a narcissist. He's like, I know I haven't, obsessed with the lightsaber as much as someone like Dooku has, but I'm still going to try it against Yoda because I'm the best, and I'm going to still try and see where I stack up. And then when he realizes, like you said, Palpatine's already won in that moment. And then when he realizes, oh, maybe I was wrong, he puts his lightsaber away once he creates distance, and he, fights Yoda with the blade. And Palpatine's, we're not trying to say that Dooku or Yoda is more powerful than Palpatine. I know that most viewers know that, but there's some that might be getting it a little bit misconstrued. Palpatine just doesn't, that's not where his focus is. But the point is, he's still going to try it because he's a narcissist.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, that's all I've got to say.
Yeah, that's all I have to say too. A lot of this is a testament to Dooku. A lot of it is a testament to Yoda. The biggest thing to take away from this is that of all the people that sort of underestimated Yoda, Palpatine never did. And because Palpatine was aware of Yoda's power, which if you read in the comics and you read in the books, Palpatine never criticizes Yoda for not being strong enough. He criticizes him for using powers, not using his power to bring what he wants upon the galaxy and enforce his will. And that's why
It's about
Yoda...
blindness and... Yeah, sorry, my bad.
No, you're good. That's why Yoda's the perfect foil to Palpatine, right? I mean, he's just...
Yeah, I mean, it's...
He's nearly as powerful.
It's about Yoda's blindness and his arrogance, which is representative of the entire Jedi Order's blindness and arrogance. Is what irks Palpatine so much, not his power per se.
Yeah, their arrogance. When I say power, I mean like what he has latent within him, but his inability to use that in a way that Palpatine believes he should be. The Force set him aside as the powerful. He should use that power. And Palpatine,
yeah.
And Palpatine is frustrated by that aspect of Yoda specifically. But that's about it, guys. Yoda, Dooku, Palpatine, the three of them, the masters of the Clone Wars era, you could say. Some of the most interesting dynamics in all of the lore, especially Dooku and Palpatine's relationship and the past relationship that he had with his master and Yoda and his need to prove his superiority. And how that all, reaches Palpatine behind the scenes and learns of the true might of the players in the game, especially when concerning Dooku. This is the moment where Dooku proves himself, and he proves himself not only to Yoda, but he proves himself also to Palpatine. And as a small little thing, I would also add, I don't really think that Yoda's intention when he fought Dooku was to prove that he was still better than his apprentice. And because of that, I don't think that Yoda's really shocked by the stalemate. I think Yoda probably anticipated that it could go that way, Yeah,
I guess that's why he gave him the "fought well you have" line.
Yeah, I never get the impression that Dooku fighting on the high level that he does is like earth-shattering to Yoda. I think that just as Palpatine never underestimated Yoda, Yoda probably never underestimated Dooku, which is another interesting facet.
But you can see Yoda putting his back into the fight with Palpatine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, but that's also the intention behind the duel. When he fights Palpatine, he's there to kill Palpatine. He's not necessarily trying to kill Dooku. If anything, he probably still hopes Dooku can embrace the light side. But, destroy the Sith we must. Yoda has one goal. That's to kill the Sith. And, it sort of goes to the character's headspace in these duels. The first duel for Yoda and Dooku, it's just a test of where the other one is in terms of their power. That's how it's going for both sides. For Yoda, it's obviously to save Obi-Wan and Anakin. But when it comes to Sidious versus Yoda, they're aiming to kill both of them.
All right, man.
Well, thank you so much, guys. If you've stayed for as long as you have, please let us know what you think about this. What are your thoughts on Yoda versus Dooku and then Yoda versus Sidious and all the characters' opinions on one another? Other topics you want to see discussed in great detail, please leave them down below. We'll be doing this series hopefully weekly. And may the Force be with you and have a great day.
Thanks for having me on again. See y'all next time.